Welcome to another episode of Yu-Gi-Oh! Player Ranks. In this series, we rank various Yu-Gi-Oh! Themes based on your comments and suggestions. Come back every tier list Tuesday to see an all-new installment of this series. Alright, what's up guys? We've got a new video today. We are doing a tier list for Master Duel. We've had 2 ban lists, actually technically 3 ban lists, since the last time that I did a competitive tier list for Master Duel. This time I'm doing more decks than I have ever done before. This is just an insane amount of decks. On top of that, I've added some categories. We've got Best, Tier 1, Tier 2, Rogue, Needs More Support, and Stop Before It's Too Late. All new categories. If there are any decks that I missed or something that I'm wrong about, put it in the comments down below. If somebody could please create like a timeline of all of the different decks that I talk about throughout and put a timestamp next to it, that would be fantastic. But let's not waste too much time. Let's get started. Right off the bat, we've got ABC. This I think is a tier 2 deck. It's actually really good, and it used to be Buster Dragon was at 1, and I always thought that was just really stupid that Buster Dragon was at 1, being ABC Buster Dragon. It should have always been a card that was at 3, because it got punished for eras that predated Master Duel. That it was basically punished for stuff that happened in the OCG like 3 years ago. It was like totally unfair. Yeah, this card has actually gone to 2. Really good. I think you'll probably be seeing more of this deck. This deck is actually really good. It interacts very well with just links in general, because all of the ABC pieces trigger in the graveyard, and having 2 ABC Buster Dragons is so much better than having 1, because sometimes you just lose the grind game because you just only have 1 ABC Buster Dragon, and it really is very helpful to have multiple. So definitely, I think this deck definitely has gotten a lot better. I don't think that it's in the tier 1 section. Depending on how strong the player is that's playing it, it actually can be higher up, but I think tier 2 is probably a fair placement for it. Next, we've got Abyss Actors. Abyss Actors is a rogue deck. This is like, the problem with Abyss Actors is, realistically, it's like the 5th best Pendulum deck. Probably even lower than the 5th best Pendulum deck. Like, there's just so many better Pendulum decks than this deck. This deck basically works around forcing your opponent to pop your cards. Like, it's not a bad deck. It's a cool gimmick. It's just, again, it's just, in terms of Pendulum decks, it's just so far down. There's so many better ones. Adamancipator, I still think, is a tier 1 deck. It got hit on the ban list, but realistically not like that deeply hit on the ban list. It got hit on, I believe, the first ban list, which was a Researcher, I think, went to 2, which is like irrelevant. It's not even like the best one. Researcher went to 2, and then Sekka's Light went to 1, which again, I just don't get. I don't know why Konami loves to hit Sekka's Light. It's like they hate that card. I don't know what I don't know who designed it, but they must have gotten fired, because every single ban list has Sekka's Light on it. TCG, OCG, Master Duel, like, always hit that card, and that card is such a fair card. It literally stops you from playing spell and trap cards. Like, yeah, you get to draw 2 cards, but you cannot play spell and trap cards. It's so stupid. Yeah, this deck is definitely like a tier 1 deck. It's a very strong combo deck. It can make some really formidable boards. The only thing I would say that hurts this deck is the fact that Crystron Heckler Firebrax has been banned, so the boards are less strong, but you can still do a lot of like synchro plays. Actually, no, it's still good, because you still have you still have the Block Dragon, you still have Union Carrier, you still have a lot of like really strong stuff. And I forgot to mention, for this, Union Carrier is still in the game, plus now you have the ABC Buster Dragon. ABCs just have so many like crazy, so much crazy combo potential. Next is the Adventurer. Now, this is pure Adventurer. I don't think you should even consider playing pure Adventurer. Adventurer is an engine, got hit on the ban list, so they lost a Water Enchantress. So you now have 1 Water Enchantress, 2 Rite of Aramesir, and 1 Foolish Burial. So you basically have 4 copies of the Adventure like starter package. It got hit again. It's a more weak engine than it was before, but it's still a very strong engine that basically helps you play around hand traps. Now, this right here, as a pure deck, do not touch it, do not play it. Not only is it has never done anything. This Adventure Pure has never done anything. It is simply an engine. Don't try it. Otherwise, it's not good at all. It's basically all about like equip cards, the field spells. Got multiple field spells, multiple equip cards, and the boss of the entire deck is Griffin Rider, which is a hard once per turn. So you can't even like summon 2 and then like have 2 negates. You literally have 1 negate. It's a really, really weak deck. The best thing you could do is play Imato Iwado, and that's pretty much it. You just stop its effect to balance itself to the hand, and yeah, it's just not a great deck. Next, we've got Agents. Agents, I think, is like at the top of Rogue. It's a really good Rogue deck. It focuses around the new Master Hyperion monster, which is actually kind of strong. It's a level 10 synchro. It's also got it's Link monster, which is a Book of Moon. Like, it's got some really, really cool stuff, really cool plays. A few problems. Well, first of all, you kind of need some of the new Sprite cards that haven't come out yet, which is the Sprite Link 2. It's going to make the deck a lot better. But outside of that, like, it's a really like decent Rogue deck. It just doesn't. It's not quite as good as some of the newer. It's not quite as good as some of the other decks on this list, and that's why it is in Rogue. Next is Aliens. Aliens is definitely a deck that just needs more support. It's not like a really weak deck. Like, it's going to beat Pure Adventure, but the problem is it just hasn't gotten a lot of modern support, and a lot of the old Alien cards they have really, really old text that is extremely slow. You have to put counters on things, and it's kind of like the first wave of Predaplan support. Like, it's way too difficult to get the counters onto the monsters to actually do the things that you want to do. But they have gotten a little bit of recent support, like with their Link monster, but for the most part, they just need more support to actually be good. Next is Ally of Justice. This is a stop before it's too late. This is literally an archetype made to counter light decks. So if this meta becomes like flooded with a light, like with the best deck in the entire game becomes a light deck, this deck might be, it might be needs more support or Rogue. But as of right now, it literally is just not good enough. There's almost no monsters in the entire deck that are even worth playing. You have Ally of Justice Catastor, which was at one point meta, but again, it's just not strong enough anymore. No one plays it. It used to be a decent Synchro 5 monster, and then you've got Ally of Justice Psycho Reader, which banishes 2 light monsters from your opponent's graveyard. It's good against Drytron, so in the Drytron meta, it was kind of good. It was good when Blue Eyes was meta, but when light decks are not meta, this deck is just trash. It was honestly just a bad deck from the start. Like, it's a really dumb concept that Konami sometimes does, which is they'll build decks around, like stopping a specific attribute, or they'll build decks around stopping synchro summoning. It's really dumb to build an entire archetype around stopping one specific thing, because if that one specific thing is not in the meta, then the deck just kind of falls off. Next, we've got Altergeist. I think Altergeist is probably a tier 1 deck. So Multi-Faker is their main I don't know if I can really even call it a combo starter. It's more of like their grind game card. But Multi-Faker is like their main card, and it went from 1 to 2, and that is actually significant because Call by the Grave is so prevalent in this game. Virtually every single deck in this game, or at least the top tier decks, all play Called by the Grave. So sometimes if you get your Multi-Faker Called by the Grave, you literally just lose because it is like your main playmaker of the entire deck. So it's so much better to have 2 Multi-Fakers in your deck. That way you can summon out your other stuff. It actually does raise the ceiling of the deck. I would even say it's probably like at the higher. It's probably better than Adamancipator because Adamancipator's lost Crystron. This didn't lose anything. It only gained Multi-Faker, and yeah, I don't think it even lost. It literally did not lose anything. Like, some of the floodgates got hit on the ban list, but I don't think it's significant enough to affect it negatively. I'd say it's probably like around a tier 1 deck. It's one of the better trap decks that you have available to you. Unfortunately, trap decks are just not that strong in this game, with the exception of one like really floodgate heavy decks, and this is not like a super floodgate heavy deck just because you're already locked into spellcasters and you lock yourself. So yeah, tier 1 is very fair. This is Amazement. Amazement is a deck. It's weird. I'm either going to put it in Rogue or needs more support. This is weird. It came out and it got like a very small amount of support, and then it has only gotten 1 support card since. So it's kind of weird. It's like Konami created the deck and then they just kind of like gave up on it. But personally, I like the deck a lot. It's a normal trap focused deck. It has normal traps, Amazement trap cards that equip themselves to either your opponent's monster or your monster, and then they gain effects based on that. Also, they have their main boss monster, Psychic monster. He special summons himself to the board. He's actually kind of like, he has a lot of attack, and he's also really cool. So as a deck, I actually really like it a lot, but unfortunately, usually when it's played as more of an engine for other trap decks, and not really within its own archetype. When you do play it pure, it can be a little bit lackluster. What is cool about this deck is it is very much a budget deck. I think the only like UR is, I think, just him. Like, other than that, there are no URs, and I think you only play like 1 to 2 copies of him anyway. Next is Amazonas. Amazonas is somewhere between Rogue and needs more support, so I'm more prompted to put in needs more support. This deck, again, is like a cool deck. Like, don't get me wrong, a lot of these decks that are like lower end here, they're cool decks. I'm not like, you know, if it's very possible that you can do very well in like silver and gold and platinum with Amazonas, but you're going to have a very, very tough time in the higher areas of like diamond with Amazonas, because the deck just doesn't do quite enough. So the positives about this deck is that it actually has some decent combo potential. It spams the board fairly easily, and it has a very, very strong grind game, because a lot of the monsters either protect themselves or they float into other monsters. That's one of the real like big positives of this deck, is that there's so much floating, which is why this deck was so good in Duel Links. It did a lot with the opening hand that you had. So even if you start with 4 cards, you got a lot done, you got a lot put onto the board, and then you have stuff like Onslaught that lets you continuously revive monsters, put monsters on the board. And on top of that, like I said, it grinds very, very well, and that's fantastic in Duel Links, where you're playing with 4 cards and the duels are lasting multiple turns. But in reality, they are just gonna, like in Master Duel, they're just gonna make a unicorn, bounce whatever monster you have back to the extra deck, and just attack you for game. So it's just not quite strong enough. There is more support that's announced, but I think it's more of like it's more fusion based support than anything else. I think they're even getting like a new fusion spell. That's so far down. That's literally, we're talking like a year down the line at least. It has to come out in Japan, then it has to come out in the TCG, and then at some point it's going to have to come out in Masters. So we're talking about a year plus until we actually see the new support for Amazonas. So who knows when that'll come. Next is Ancient Gears. This is definitely like a rogue deck. Unfortunately, Ancient Gears it's an OTK deck, but there are just so many better OTK decks than Ancient Gears. You have Numerons, you have Cyber Dragons. Cyber Dragons is a machine plus OTK deck that is a better machine plus OTK deck than Ancient Gears. The problem with Ancient Gears, and again, I'm not saying that you cannot get to Platinum with the decks. I'm just saying the scale for this is the easiest to get to Platinum is up here, and it just descends downward. So it's just going to take you more work, but you can get to Platinum with Ancient Gears. It's going to take more work. Or not Platinum, Diamond, but it's going to take more work. So with this deck, again, it's just very resource intensive. You're going second because the whole objective is to OTK. You have an in-archetype card, Ancient Gear Wyvern, that literally prevents you from setting cards. So you couldn't even like create a going first build, because you literally cannot set cards. The deck prevents you from having a sort of going first strategy. Literally, it prevents you. And then going second, you are playing through a ton of negates. So you're going to have to play a bunch of blowout cards. And then on top of that, I think the biggest issue with this deck is that it is so resource intensive. The best monster you have available to you is Ancient Gear Chaos Giant, which is a really strong card. It's unaffected by spells, unaffected by traps. When you attack, monster effects can't be activated, and it attacks all monsters your opponent controls. I think it does like piercing or something like that. It does a lot of really, really cool things, except it's affected by monsters, which is the main form of interruption in the modern game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And that is kind of the big issue, and it requires you to use four Ancient Gear monsters, which again is kind of an issue. That's a lot of monsters when you're already playing through a 3-4 negate board. So that's kind of the biggest issue with Ancient Gears. Appliancers, I think, is a deck that just needs more support. I think it's got a cool like engine, but I don't think it's quite strong enough to do anything. Next is Arcana Force. So this is pure Arcana Force, which is stop before it's too late. It's a deck based around like coin flips. I think it's a disaster. Now, you can also make an Arcana Force deck that is, it's a Danger Dark World Arcana Force deck that basically skips your opponent's entire turn. That I would probably put in somewhere like up here, like a rogue deck. The problem is that deck just isn't that great going second. Going first, it's pretty cool. Going second, it's not that good. You basically use Danger, Dark Worlds to summon Yugioh, draw a bunch of cards, draw this out, summon this, skip your opponent's turn, activate the field spell, make sure that effect is guaranteed, skip your opponent's turn, come back to your turn and attack. Again, going second, that really doesn't do anything because they've already set up all of their negates and their board, so it kind of just sucks. Also, that deck basically plays into max C. If you don't, your only option is literally just to deck out your opponent. But pure Arcana Force, do not play this. It's a coin flip deck that is an absolute disaster. Next we've got, this is Armed Dragon. Now Armed Dragon may seem like a bad deck, like a bad TV show deck, and I would agree with you, in the TCG this deck is not that good. In Master Duel, this deck is actually quite good. It might even be tier 1. So basically what this deck does is it spams level 7 monsters. It's very good at spamming level 7 wind dragons. And the best XYZ monster in the game, in Master Duel, is Galaxy Tomahawk. It allows you to summon any number of tokens, and then you can use those tokens to summon out Mecha Phantom Beast, Auradon, and then once you summon Mecha Phantom Beast Auradon, you can literally do all of the combos that you could previously do with Crystron Hacklefibrax that basically are gone now because that card is banned. So you can do all of those old combos, summon Thumb Dragon Colossus, summon Borreload, summon Baron de Fleur. You can do all of those combos, but now you have to take this route. So this deck is actually really, really strong just because so many other decks got hit on the ban list. Next we've got Aromages, or Aromatherapy. Yeah, this needs more support. I don't think this is a bad deck by any means. I actually think it's actually a really, really cool gimmick, or I guess a really cool strategy. So basically what this deck does is all of your cards have effects as long as you have more life points than your opponents. And typically I would say that's a very good thing, right? Because most of the time you both at 8,000, or your opponent pays life points to do something and you have more life points than your opponent. But the problem is that is the old Yu-Gi-Oh paradigm. The problem is the new Yu-Gi-Oh paradigm is a lot of the best decks in the game actually burn your life points or can attack directly. So for example, Sky Strikers have Hayate. It attacks you directly for 1500. Or it has Kaina, who makes your opponent gain 100 life points. So they can, as soon as they see you playing this, they can just do that. You have Sword Soul, for example. Sword Soul is a deck that inflicts 1200 to you for no reason. So now you're down on life points, so none of these Aromage effects actually do anything. Also, you have things like, for example, that's not Mirror Jade. You have the Despia card. That's another really, really strong deck in the meta. You have a monster, Masquerade, that burns you every single time you activate a card. Well, now you don't have higher life points than your opponent. So again, that's kind of an issue there. The problem with this deck is there's really not a lot of easy ways to gain life points very, very quickly. And sometimes your opponent just plays random bird cards that just totally shuts down your deck. That's why this deck is where it is. But overall, I think it's a pretty cool deck. Next, we've got the Scythe Lock. I think this is, as an engine, it's a decent engine in Master Duel. The problem is this: if you play against like Eldl Lich, it literally does nothing. Play against ffloowandereeze, it literally does nothing. It does nothing against a lot of decks, so I think that's why the Scythe Lock is kind of like trash. As a pure deck, I think it's somewhere like over here. It needs more support. We're talking pure artifacts. It's a deck that needs more support. Like, you could pop your own stuff with ignition and stuff like that, but I don't think it's quite enough. So needs more support is probably a fair place. This is Assault Mode Activate. This is actually a decent engine, but I don't think it's a good deck. So as an engine, it's pretty good. You summon the Psy Reflector, and then you activate Psy Reflector to search the Assault Beast to get this, and you basically always get to either a Synchro 8 or a Synchro 9 or Synchro 7. You basically have very easy access to virtually any Synchro 6 through 9, which is cool because it's a one card 6 through 9 Synchro monster. It does a lot. You can get to Chaos Ruler, and Chaos Ruler can kind of like start your Synchro engine. It basically replaces what Needle Fiber did in a lot of different ways. As an engine, it's very good, but as a pure deck, I just don't think it does enough. All it really does is summon the Stardust, and Stardust is basically a free negate. Pretty cool, but just like it's just not quite enough. Next is Atlanteans. This is either Rogue or maybe like tier 2. This is like Atlantean, Mermail, like the whole squad, the whole water squad. Not a bad deck by any means. It can spit out Toad. I think tier 2 is very, very fair for this deck. There's a lot of different ways to build it. Unfortunately, this deck is very expensive, so it's one of the reasons I don't think you see it all that often. Like, I literally have never seen anybody play this, but I know from like personal experience of playing this deck that it actually is a very, very strong deck. Definitely, that would easily translate to Master Duel. I can play a lot of a lot of different extenders. It's a really strong deck. Mecha Phantom Beast as a pure deck is kind of like needs more support. You literally never see anybody play this as a pure deck. This deck is just a bunch of different token generating engines in totally unaffiliated decks. You've got the XYZ monster, the Draco Sack, which certain people use. You have obviously Oridon, which didn't get banned, but probably should have got banned instead of the Crystron Heckler Firebrax, but we have to live with those decisions. And then you've got Mecha Phantom Beast O-Line. So you basically, it's a bunch of ships that generate smaller ships, which are tokens, which as an archetype is just not quite enough. They don't really do anything. They don't put up any negates. They don't really do anything. All they do is like pop cards and put up tokens. It's not quite strong enough. Next is Ancient Warriors. I think Ancient Warriors is probably like a rogue deck. It's a higher end rogue deck. It's a going second, summon big monsters, pop your opponent's cards. It's a pretty cool deck. They protect each other from targeting, from destruction. Like, they have really, really cool effects. It's a cool going second deck. You don't really have to use your extra deck. The only extra deck monsters you really go into, I think they only have like one extra deck monster, and it's a monster that bounces a card you control, your opponent controls. Basically, yeah, I think it's a pretty decent deck. It's a bunch of Beast Warriors. Decent going second deck, not terribly broken. Next, we've got Burning Abyss. Burning Abyss is probably like a tier 2 deck. Not super broken, not super bad. Kind of like, it's a decent graveyard deck. Most of the time, people will just use this engine in Phantom Knights and really not actually play Burning Abyss. The best way to play Burning Abyss pure is, of course, the Trap Burning Abyss deck with a bunch of various, just strong trap cards. Going second, going first trap cards, typically pretty good. Bead Troopers is probably like a tier 2 deck. It's the only advantage that it has over TCG version of it is that it can actually search Max C. But again, searching Max C is like, you gotta ask yourself, what if you play against Eldl Lich? What if you play against ffloowandereeze? What if you play against any amount of these other decks that just literally Max C does nothing against them? Also, the deck doesn't really do like a ton in terms of, like, it's very good at spamming monsters, but your best board usually ends on a Cicada, which negates a monster effect, and a Scary Moth, which basically just, it's kind of like a window which limits the amount of summons that you can do in a turn, special summons. So those are kind of the issues. Its end board isn't particularly strong, and yes, you can search Max C with Inzektor Picaflana, and I think it's a retaliating, so you send it to the graveyard and then you can search it. So you can search Max C, but I don't think it's quite enough to make it like a tier 1 or best deck. You don't actually see it that often. Also, Floodgates like really hurt this deck. Next, we've got the BES. Definitely needs more support. Its recent support, I'll give it this. Its recent support has actually been kind of good. It's gotten a field spell, which is pretty good, and it's gotten a new monster. It's like MK something. Its new monster and its new field spell are actually really kind of good, but outside of the field spell and the monsters, deck is literally like all of the old stuff from all of the old sets, all of the big ships, like Big Core and stuff like that. They are literally just hot garbage, and they have like old text from like 2007 and 2006, so they are just not strong enough. But the new stuff is actually good. So if this deck got like 5-6 new cards, I think it could actually be decent. Blue Eyes, it's weird. It's probably like somewhere around like a higher end rogue deck. So Blue Eyes is actually, it's probably better than Ancient Warrior. So Blue Eyes is, here's the positive thing about Blue Eyes. Let's go about the negatives first. So Crystron Heckler Firebrax got banned, and that is a huge negative for Blue Eyes because it actually did really, really, really rely on that card. That is like the main play starter for Blue Eyes for a very long time because it puts stones in the grave from field to grave. That's number one. And then it allowed you to summon more stones because you can summon the stone and the stone triggers in the graveyard during the end phase. So that was actually one of the real big positives of Crystron Heckler Firebrax. And then during your opponent's turn, you could take a random Blue Eyes and summon like an FA Dawn Dragster. I'm sorry, yeah, a Formula Synchron, and then turn it into a Baron de Fleur. So that was like an additional draw, an additional interruption. And with Crystron Heckler Firebrax banned, now you have to do other things to basically change the engine. So you can play like the Assault Mode Activate engine, or you can go in the direction of the Despia Blue Eyes, or you can go in the direction of like a Trap Blue Eyes or a Danger Blue Eyes. You basically have to change direction of your Blue Eyes deck because obviously you don't have access to Crystron Heckler Firebrax anymore, which is unfortunate because this is one of the decks that actually really negatively got affected by that ban. Like, there are a lot of degenerate strategies. This is not one of those degenerate strategies. Like, literally, it helped Blue Eyes just get the stones out of the deck and onto the field. Like, it wasn't broken by any means. It just does stuff because Konami has not given Blue Eyes generic support that allows it to search the stones. The only way to search the stones is Sage, and Sage requires a normal summon. So outside of that, there's literally no way to search the stones, and this was kind of, Needle Fiber was one of the ways that you could actually throw them onto the board, and it's kind of unfortunate for them. Next, we've got Blackwings, probably like a rogue deck somewhere around here. Again, decent rogue deck. The best I've seen it is mixed with Raid Raptors and some of the new Raid Raptor support. Outside of that, like pure Blackwings is a little choppy. It's obviously got a very good boss monster, unaffected by everything, very strong in that right, but again, it's just kind of, it doesn't quite do enough, and that's kind of the issue. This is a deck that actually has new support coming out in the TCG in just a couple of months, which means in Master Duel we might get it in the next 2 years. I don't know, but we'll see when we get it. Decent deck for sure. Rogue Boojins needs more support, just not quite strong enough. They have a good generic Link monster for XYZ monsters, but as a pure deck, it's such a like a deck of a past era. It's just not strong enough whatsoever. Next, we've got Buster Blader. Buster Blader is actually a really cool deck. I think it's probably like bottom of Rogue. It's a cool deck. It's very good, obviously, against dragon decks, and you can set up a dragon lock and do some cool stuff. There is a really, really fun Dogmatica Buster Blader deck that you can play, but the issue is that the Dogmatica engine is so heavily neutered on Master Duel. Like, Nadir Servant is limited to 1, which makes it kind of annoying to play because it's just so, it's down to so few. Again, it's one of those cards that's paying for formats that happened before Master Duel, and I don't think it's particularly fair, because I think compared to some of the newer decks, Nadir Servant is just not that unfair. So I think Buster Blader is definitely bottom of Rogue. Chainburn is a decent deck. I think it's somewhere in Rogue. Let's be honest, sometimes this deck just catches you off guard. You're just going to lose. Like, if they just go first, they set up all the traps, all of the secret barrel, this, that, they have all that stuff set up. Sometimes it just catches you off guard. You have no response. You just lose a game. Like, there's nothing you can do. Sometimes you just straight up lose against Chainburn. And that will never quite change. Chaos Space. This is a card. I don't know what it's asking me to review here. This is a card, not a deck. It's a good card. It's not a stop before it's too late. The card is good, but I'm not... yeah, good card, but it's not really quite a deck. Chaos Dragon, as opposed to regular Blue Eyes, I'd probably say it's somewhere around here. Honestly, regular Blue Eyes and Master Duel is probably just better than Chaos Max. You can win with Chaos Max. There's a lot of different ways. Drytron, Chaos Max. There's the Dogmatica Chaos Max. Again, Dogmatica is kind of heavily neutered on the ban list, so I'd say somewhere around there. Cloudians needs more support for sure. Cool archetype, just not quite strong enough. Code Talkers as a deck is probably like either tier 2, probably somewhere around Rogue. Like a decent Rogue deck, not super strong, not super bad. Still missing a few of the new support cards, but when it gets those, I think it'll be a very strong deck. This is Crusadia. Crusadia is a really, really strong OTK deck. Going first, it can set up a pretty formidable, like, going first board, but going second is, I think going second, Crusadia is where Crusadia shines. Crusadia Equimax, one of the busted cards you've ever seen. Going first, it can set up really cool boards with some of the kaijus, because believe it or not, kaijus actually do have effects outside of tributing your opponent's monster, so I think Rogue is probably fair to put it. This is easily, Crystal Beast is easily and needs more support one. Crystal Beast straight up is getting a structure deck with like 4 new cards. There's a new card in the tin. In its current form, Crystal Beast just don't do enough. They have no grind game, no negates, no interruptions, no nothing. So definitely, hopefully the new support actually helps the deck do something. This is, what is this? Let me zoom in. Is this Numeron? Yeah, this is Numeron. I've never seen it like that. So I do this every single time. Well, the last tier list, I actually did the same thing. I think Numeron is actually a very, very strong deck in Master Duel, because in reality, it's a best of 1 game, and your opponent's not going to be ready for you to just have an OTK strategy. This is a really, really strong card, especially since a lot of the like 4 negate, 5 negate boards are gone. This is exactly the type of meta where Numerons just come in and clean up, because the boards are all going to be like reduced. The best decks in the game are going to be like swordsoul, it's going to be like despia, stuff like that. So when you have decks that end on 2 interruptions, this is literally what Numeron is built to combat. You just catch so many people off guard with Numeron, and in a best of 1 meta, you just lightning storm, okay, they negated it. Kaiju, okay, now that's gone, and now you just activate your field spell, summon the 4 monsters, attack, gain, stop them from getting destroyed, double your attack, stop, double your attack for 8,000, game. That's it. It literally is that simple. It is like the most simple-minded deck ever. You just play a bunch of Kaijus, Lava Golem, etc., hand traps, forbidden droplets, all of those various cards, activate Numeron, and just attack for game. It's one of the easiest decks like to win with. Yeah, and there's so many different ways to search the Numeron network that you don't have to stress about like drawing it. Really, really good, really good deck. Next we've got Cyber Angels. Somewhere around here. I don't think you should play this deck pure. This is more of like a very small engine in a Drytron deck. No reason for you to actually be playing this deck pure. This is Cyber Darks. This is the Cyber Dark version of the Cyber Dragon deck. I think it's probably somewhere around here. And it's on a giant monster. It's unaffected by everything. If your opponent can't deal with it, you literally win the duel. And that's kind of the benefit of these, adding the Cyber Darks to a Cyber Dragon deck. Pure Cyber Dragon, like we're talking OTK, Go Second Cyber Dragon. Again, pretty good deck. You basically clear their board. You summon the one that attacks for every material you send, and then you send the materials, activate their effects, and then you just attack, and you win the game. Plus, this game still has Verde Anaconda, whereas the TCG and OCG don't have Verde Anaconda, so that's actually quite cool, so you still have access to all those plays. This is, I'm just going to put this next to Code Talkers. I guess it's Pure Sideburst. If you're playing Pure Sideburst, you're probably playing Code Talkers, so I'm going to put it there. Dangers as a deck. This is more of an engine than a deck. If you're playing Danger Dark World, I think it's probably somewhere around here. I'll put Dark World like right here too. Danger Dark World, pretty strong deck. Very good at decking out your opponent. If your opponent ever max sees you, literally just win. It's like the coolest part of this deck. If your opponent tries to max you literally win every single time. And also this deck puts up some really strong like boards. Going first, going second. I personally prefer in general in Yu-Gi-Oh to go second. So I mean, again, that's me. So I'm going to go for the build with like Bigfoot and Grapha and just go second, destroy all your cards, super poly, and just win the game. But you also have the going first version, which ends on like 4 or 5 negates. And it really is kind of like, the problem with this deck is it's kind of a luck game. Sometimes you activate like Danger Bigfoot and it gets picked and you're going first. Then you just lose a card. Nothing happens. You just lose a card in card advantage. And sometimes you just get really unlucky on the dangers. And that's kind of like the big negative side of this deck. So, yeah, that's kind of the problem with it. But in general, that's one of the issues. The other issue is you can't play hand traps because they will get discarded. And the other issue is you can't play things like Call by the Grave because you can't set quick play spell cards. Because if you cannot set and activate quick play spell cards, you can't activate quick play spell cards the same turn they are set. So if you set a Call by the Grave to try to get it to not be sniped, and then you activate a danger and your opponent like drolls you can't activate the Call by the Grave. But if you leave it in your hand, it might get sniped by one of the dangers and get you no value. So that's kind of like the conundrum there. Next is Dark Lords. Dark Lords is probably like a rogue deck. Dark Lords was actually a decent engine that you can play in. Not an engine. You can basically summon this Dark Lord monster, the big Dark Lord fusion monster. It's 3 fairies. You can play it in Despia, but in reality, there's just so many better cards to actually play in Despia and branded Despia. You don't need to play it. As Dark Lords as a deck, actually has a really high ceiling. The problem with it is it's just extremely bricky because it's literally all level 8 monsters, and sometimes you just start with too many monsters and not enough spells and you have nothing to do, and that's kind of like the big issue with the deck. DDDs is either tier 1 or tier 2. Super rewarding, super fun deck to play. Has a ton of different combo lines. It's actually like it's what I love about this deck is it's not particularly like broken by any means, but it does set up very formidable boards, and it's so rewarding to play all and learn all of the different play lines. And the better you get at this deck, literally the better you get at this game. Like it does everything. It's synchro summons, it's XYZ summon, link summons, pendulum summon. It literally does everything that this normal summon. Trap spells. It literally does everything this game has ever done all in one deck, and it's super rewarding to play. It's not broken, and it's not like terrible to play against. Like you're never like, oh my god, DDDs, I am overwhelmed, there's nothing I can do. It's not like those huge negate boards that were being made with the Crystron, with the Auradon. It's not anything like that. It's actually a very fair deck to play and play against, and it's very rewarding to play. So tier 1 this is Demise. I think Demise needs more support. I think it's a decent deck. It's a decent going second OTK deck. But again, the problem with this is there's so many better going second OTK decks as it is. And then you're involving a ritual component in that, which, again, you have to ritual something, then you have to summon that. So your card has to survive a spell negate, and then when you summon the monster, it has to survive an additional monster negate. And when you're going second, you want as many resources as possible. So you want cards that, like Raigeki, that will take out, you activate one Raigeki, it takes out 3 cards. With rituals, you have to invest multiple cards into the summon when you're already going second. You're already down because your opponent has gone through all of these steps to create this giant board. And now you are activating a spell and you're attributing a monster in your hand to summon another monster in your hand. You basically have to invest 3 cards to summon 1 card, and then your opponent can just like solemn strike that one monster when it finally hits the board, when it activates its effect. And you basically gave up 3 cards to lose to 1 card. And that's kind of the problem with going second ritual decks. And that's why Demise kind of falls down there. Deskbot's Pure is an absolute, needs more support. It's a good engine with, it was a good engine when Crystron Hackle Vibrax was in the game. Now that it's not, it is where it is. Next is Despia. Despia is probably one of the strongest decks in the game. This is Despia with branded Despia, one of the best decks in the game. One of the decks you will see at top tier every single time. Very strong deck. Probably, like I said, one of the better decks in the game. Final countdown. Not final countdown. This is Destiny board. Stop before it's too late. There's too much back row removal in this game. This deck was like a fun deck that you could bring to your locals in 2005. And even then you would just lose to a heavy storm. And that has not changed. There's so much back row removal in this game. Yes, I know the field spell can protect your back row, but again, it's just not quite good enough. There's Nightmare Unicorn is in every single extra deck, and it literally spins your back row away. So I just don't think it's a very smart choice. Heroes as a deck is probably tier 2, maybe tier 1. Probably tier 2. I think the biggest problem with heroes is that it just straight up, number 1 is straight up loses to Nibiru. There's nothing that you can do against Nibiru in a hero deck. They don't have an answer to it. And it's frustrating. And now that Crossout Designator is at 1, they have less answers to it. Literally, if your opponent has a Nibiru in their hand, you're playing heroes, you just lose. You lose your board. There's nothing you can do. There's no negates. All you basically have is Plasma to steal a monster, negate on-board monster fakes, which does nothing against Nibiru. You have Darklaw, which is a very strong card, and then you've got Malicious Bane, and that's a decent board against a lot of decks. Or of course you've got the water monsters, the acid and the acid and the other guy. The 2 waters, the one that destroys back row and destroys monsters. Those are really cool. You can mask change them. That's all really cool. The problem is literally you have no way to play against Nibiru. It's the same problem this deck has in the TCG. You just don't have an out to Nibiru. Next we've got Digital Bugs, needs more support. I actually think this is kind of a cool deck. It's basically a flip effect insect deck. Not a flip effect, I'm sorry. It is a flip insect deck. So it doesn't require the monsters to be face down. It just requires them to change their battle positions. Pretty cool. It's got a new support card. I wouldn't say new, but it was released a few sets ago. This is kind of like a deck where if it got released in 2000, let's say it got released in 2009, I think this deck could have actually been a decent deck, but this got released well past its prime. I think it would have been a really fun deck in 2009. there probably would have been a few cards in this deck that could have been banned in 2009. But I just don't. I think this deck is far, far, far too slow to be played in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! It makes very non-formidable boards. Again, it's just kind of like, if you're going to play insects, just play Bee Troopers. Bee Trooper is probably the best insect deck that you could possibly play. This deck is just not quite that strong. It ends on a lot of the same cards that Bee Troopers can. So like Cicada King and like Scary Moth and stuff like that. But again, Bee Troopers just does it so much more consistently, so much easier. So if you want to play insects, play that. Or play like Giant Ballpark, but don't play this. Next, we've got Dynomist. I think, again, this is one of those things where it's like, I'll put it next to Abyss Actors. And I think it's slightly better than Abyss Actors. This deck is a really, really cool, it's a machine-based pendulum deck. Personally, this is one of my favorite pendulum decks of all time, but I have to be realistic about it. It has a really good trap card, Dynomist Howling. It has some really, really strong and cool cards. The problem with this deck, again, is it's just, when you look at pendulum decks, it is literally like the 5th or 6th best pendulum option. DDD is better. And Endymion is better. There's just so many options despite how cool this deck is. It can make Cyber Dragon Infinity, stuff like that. But again, it's just a weaker option of other strategies. And that's kind of the problem. Dinomorphia is basically, I'd say it's probably in Rogue. Basically, this is a controlled dinosaur fusion deck that is based around paying half your life points over and over and over and over. And you basically just keep paying your life points till you have like 7.3 life points. Like, it literally just keeps paying and paying and paying your life points. And I think it's a decent deck. It's a fun deck to play. The issue is, again, it's just not quite strong enough. You don't have to worry about your opponent just like attacking for 100 life points because all of your trap cards banish themselves out of the graveyard to protect from damage of any kind. So cool deck, but just not quite there, unfortunately. It is getting another wave of support, so just be mindful of that. Dinosaurs going second, and there's two different ways to play dinosaurs. You can either, it's probably somewhere here, dinosaurs you can go first, and you can set up like a multi-negation board, and actually Pankratrops is now at 2, which probably helps the deck quite a bit because it's a card that you can very easily search with Petite Pterodon. But most of the time they were actually, even when Pankratrops was at 3, from what I remember, they actually only played 1 because you can search it with Petite Pterodon. But again, this is a half decent deck. Going second, which again, I prefer going second. Most people like to go first and set up a board. I would prefer to go second. Going second, this deck is actually quite good. You can use Pot of Extravagance. You now have 2 Pankratrops, summon Pankratrops pop cards, put a lot of pressure on the board. Summon, obviously, Tyranno, attack, book everything face down. Like, it's got a lot of cool options going second, and it's got a lot of cool options going first. It's actually quite an expensive deck, so it's one of the real drawbacks to this deck. They should release a structure deck for this deck. That would actually be kind of cool. Dark Magician is probably around like Rogue. I'll put it like next to Blue Eyes. You can honestly, like, these are kind of like interchangeable. They're not far from each other. So again, Dark Magician is actually, so the biggest issue with Dark Magician is it's missing a lot of its support. So Blue Eyes got its support, which is why it's maintained kind of like a higher Rogue status. Just because, like, yeah, Crystron got hit, but you know, it's maintained something because it's gotten a lot of new cards. It's got like Dictator of D, stuff like that. Dark Magician has not gotten any of its new cards, and from what the leaks have data mined, it's not supposed to be scheduled to be put in at any time close by. So we really don't know when the new Dark Magician stuff is actually coming to the game, which is kind of one of the more frustrating parts of Master Duel. As a deck itself, it's actually kind of good because the advantage that it has over the TCG is that it has so many different draw cards. Like spell-based draw cards. Also, you have the Spellbook engine, which I would think is very, very interesting to see it mixed into a Dark Magician deck. Just because Dark Magician activates so many spells naturally. You have like Into the Void, you have 3 Upstart Goblins, Chicken Game, etc., etc. You have so many spell cards. And then the Spellbook engine is actually quite decent in a Dark Magician deck. And you can basically end on an additional Jowgen the Spiritualist, which would make the deck, you know, raise the ceiling of the deck. We'll see how it goes. I hope to see somebody mix it with Spellbooks. I think that would be really cool. Next, we've got Dogmatica. I think Dogmatica is like a rogue deck. I don't think you should play this deck pure. The problem, like, Dogmatica with Shadal is cool. Dogmatica with other stuff is cool. Now, Dogmatica by itself is kind of like iffy just because as a pure deck, it's not that good. And unfortunately, again, Dear Servant is limited to 1. It should really be a 3. I'm not sure why it's limited to 1. Next, we've got Dragon Link, which I think is like a tier 1 deck. It's probably like right here. It's a really strong, it's probably the best dragon deck in the entire game. It just spits out like insane boards. There's not a lot that is different from like the TCG or the OCG. The deck still tops here and there. It was still topping in the metagame with Despia. Actually, you could even make the argument that it's up here. It's like it's that strong of a deck. It's even when Despia was topping, this deck was still like a top deck. It was still getting top 8s, regionals, YCSs, everything like that. Like I said, it makes insane boards. As long as you can get to a Chaos Rule, you can really get the party started, and then you can get to the Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss, and from there on in, you make Warlord Savage. You just keep going and going and going and going, and you literally just build such a strong board. Again, Crystron got hit, but Crystron wasn't really even like that much a part of this deck anymore. Next is Dragon Maze. This is like, so many people love this deck. I'm so tired of seeing the stupid avatar everywhere. You always see this avatar, and then you always see this this mate. Like, that's it. Like, everybody's got this mate. Everyone's got this avatar. I think this is a decent deck. I don't think it's like that good. I probably put in the area of like a... It's probably like a rogue deck, like somewhere around here. It's what it's got for going for itself is that it's very, very consistent, and the engine is quite decent. What it has not going for it, what it has going against it, is that it just has a very low ceiling. It just doesn't do that much. You have like the trap. You set up like Hieratic Seal of Heavenly Spheres, maybe one monster on field, and then the trap card that bounces face down, and maybe the trap card in graveyard. Sometimes you will additionally get this fusion monster, which is another interruption. But again, like the ceiling on the deck is just so low that sometimes you get like a 3 interruption board, but you do have a lot of recursion. That's what the deck has. It has a lot of recursion, but it just doesn't put up the most formidable boards. That's kind of the issue with the deck. Next we've got, this is Dragoonity. Dragoonity is probably somewhere around here. I think, again, it's a dragon deck that's not quite as strong as some of the other dragon decks. So I think it's not quite as strong as like the Arom dragon deck, and I don't think it's as strong as Dragon Link, and that's kind of the issue. It's just not quite as strong as some of the other dragon decks. It is a weaker option dragon deck. Yeah, that's kind of the problem with it. It has some cool cards. Like Gaydur is still one of the greatest like synchro monsters. Not once per turn, just keep searching. Really strong. Really, really high ceiling. Just lacking some power. We got, what is this? This is Zodiacs. Zodiacs with tri-brigade is a decent deck. Probably like tier 2, tier 1, somewhere around here. Like decent deck. Nothing too crazy. I'd probably say somewhere around here. You see it every once in a while, but it's definitely not like, I remember like the first week that Master Duel came out, like literally every duel you played was either Drytron or Zodiac tri-brigades, but now it's really fallen off. You really don't see it that often. Drytron is another deck. You can put it in tier 1 or 2. It's probably like tier 2. It's probably something around here. It's gotten hit on the ban list significantly, but again, if all of the other decks on the ban list have gotten hit, and this deck kind of just remained at the same power that it already is, you can imagine that this deck probably will kind of like move up the slot a little bit. So I think it's there. Drytron, I'll put this right next to the Herald because, again, people play these together. You're not going to not play these. You're not going to not play Herald in Drytron. You're not going to not play Drytron and Herald. Like, you're just going to play both of those decks and both of those. This is Machina. I'm going to just call it the Earth Machine deck. This deck is actually quite strong. It's definitely like a tier 2 deck. If you've never played against it, it's got like so much good going for it. It's got a bunch of trap cards that it can main. It can main deck Skill Drain. It can main deck Goes in Match, which both got hit. But again, it doesn't matter because you just replace the floodgates with other floodgates. You can play Rivalry because all your monsters are machines. You can play Skill Drain because all your monsters like 3 million attack, and their effects half the time will actually prevent you from doing stuff. But if you have Skill Drain, they literally just don't prevent you from doing those things. And then on top of, and they have graveyard effects. And then you can play Gozen because everybody's Earth. So the deck is actually like sick, like really, really strong. And then you have a bunch of spamming. You have a bunch of Earth Machine archetypes that have come out over the years that you just pile into this one deck. You have the Trains, you have the Machinas, and you have the Infinite Tracks. You pile it into one deck and you just drop like 3 million damage, and then your opponents, they just shake their head and can't believe what you just did to them. Really good deck. Egyptian gods need more support. There is more support coming out of the tins. Unfortunately, spoiler alert, it's not enough support. There's still no way to search Obelisk. There's still no way to search Raw. There is a way to search Raw. There's actually multiple ways to search Raw. There is no way to search Obelisk, and there's no way to search Slifer, which is so dumb. I don't know why you can't search them. You just have to draw them. You have to get lucky and draw them. There's no other way to do it. And that's kind of the big detriment. You have to play 3 copies and hope you see it. If you don't see it, well, yeah, there goes your win condition. Next is, we've got Eldl Lich. I think Eldl Lich is still a tier 1 deck. I think it's dropped off. You haven't seen it quite as often. That's mostly because of the adventure engine. So 2 things counted very badly against Eldl Lich in the previous meta, which actually in the next meta are not going to count against it. So one of the negative things against Eldl Lich is the adventure engine can bounce floodgates. So you have Draco back can bounce like a Gozen match, or it can bounce like a rivalry, or it can bounce a skill drain. That's really something that counted negatively against this deck. Secondly, it's really tough to go second, even when you have all those different floodgates, when your opponent sets up a crazy board. Now, the positive thing is that board, those crazy boards that Needle Fiber or Crystron Heckler Firebrax enabled are gone. In addition to that, the adventure engine has been hit once again, so it's a lot weaker than it was previously. You only basically have 4 copies, right? Because you have 2 Rite of Aramiseers, one of the Water Enchanters, and you've got 1 Foolish Barrel. So the deck actually got hit very significantly. So that engine being so much weaker actually allows Eldl Lich to probably actually move back up to one of the better tiers. This is still somehow the best trap card, the best trap deck in the entire game. And it's kind of insane because we started this in January. This game came out in January of this year, 2022, and it's been 9 months, and this is still the best trap deck in the game because you can main deck so many floodgates. And I understand Skill Drain got hit to 2, Gozen got hit to 2, Rivalry got hit to 2, and that's all great. But you know what that means? They can just put in more floodgates. Like they can just put in, they can just put in like lose 1 turn, and they can put in things like summon limit. Like it never ends. You can just put in more and more and more various floodgates. Now, some floodgates like Imperial Order got hit, stuff like that. So some of the real game-winning floodgates got hit. So I think it's probably like around tier 1, but it's still the best trap deck in the entire game, which is kind of insane because it's been so many months. This is a deck that I don't think is that strong. This is Element Sabers. It does not do enough. It requires so many resources in your hand, and then you end on a board that's just so like lackluster. It's insane how, like, this deck is so bad. It's probably around here. Like, it's not like bad like these decks, but it is so not good that literally I don't think this deck would be meta in like 2005. Like that's how slow and that's how slow this deck is. It is literally that slow and that like terrible to play. It does very little. You have to discard all of these cards to actually summon these monsters. They change attribute in the graveyard. You need 5 monsters to summon any of the element sabers, which is a lot of monsters. This deck does not put that many monsters in the graveyard very, very easily. It is just not a very well-built deck. Next, and it definitely needs more. It hasn't gotten support. It came out in 2017, and it hasn't gotten support since 2017, which is kind of crazy. Sometimes they do that. Next is Endymion. I believe this is Endymion, right? Yeah, this is a spell power mastery, but this is not where I placed it. This is one of the best pendulum decks of the game. Endymion is probably like around tier 1. In the Master Cup, I think what's crazy, in the Master Cup, this deck was actually in the top 3. It got 3rd place in the Master Cup. And on top of that, it actually not only get 3rd place, but I think the spell books actually are really, really strong in this. And you actually have access to the new spell book, which is off the ban list, which is not the card that came off the ban list, which allows you to add a bunch of spell book cards and summon a monster from your deck. I think this deck will definitely be a lot better in the upcoming meta. Evil Eye is probably needs more support. Actually, it's probably like around like a rogue deck. It's a decent rogue deck. It basically is like, it summons like a big monster, just keeps gaining attack, gaining attack, gaining attack. You're basically protecting that monster with your spawn trap cards, your equip cards. But again, it literally, you're relying your entire deck on having 1 monster on the board. If they kaiju it, you literally just lose the duel. Not bad. Exodia decks are just not, I'm sorry, they're not it. It's cool to have an alternate win condition. I think it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun for Yu-Gi-Oh! The problem is, I don't think it's actually quite that strong. And a lot of times, going second with an Exodia deck is almost physically impossible, because you need every single card in your hand. And if they hand trap anything or they negate anything, you literally just, you lose. Sometimes you just lose. You have an awkward hand. Sometimes you will have, literally, this deck, Exodia, is like playing solitaire. You just activate spells, continuously drawing until you draw the 5 Exodia pieces. Sometimes you will literally be playing against the computer, and the computer has no interruptions whatsoever, and you still can't draw Exodia. That's how inconsistent the Exodia kind of deck is. And then if you're playing like a classic Exodia deck, like a Trap Exodia, oh, I'm going to activate Wabaku, my opponent can't attack. They'll just keep setting up negates, and then eventually your Wabakus will just be negated, and they'll just attack you and punch you in the face. So not quite good enough. Next is Exo Sisters. Exo Sisters it's one of those decks. It's like Alley of Justice. It literally is just like Alley of Justice. It is a deck that depends on the meta. So if your opponent's summoning from the graveyard and moving cards out of the graveyard, fantastic deck. It's great. It actually just won a TCG YCS. So good in that regard. But again, like Alley of Justice, this is really good against light decks. When there are light decks in the meta, this deck can actually, or some of its cards can come forward and actually be good. Same thing with Exo Sisters. It can come forward and be good at some times. But the problem is if your metagame is not based around it, or if you play against a deck that doesn't play through the graveyard, like if you play against like Altergeist or something like that, or you play against Eldl Lich, or like or a pendulum deck, like decks that do not use the graveyard, that don't care about the graveyard, literally this deck does nothing, and suddenly it just becomes so much weaker. Also, I don't believe that their newest monster, Martha, is in the game yet, so it's not quite as strong as it should be. When Martha comes out, we can have a different discussion. It might be a better deck. Next, we've got FA. I probably like needs more support. I haven't seen a lot of this deck be played. I remember when it came out, it was kind of like a cool deck. It's a level modulating deck, and yeah, based on the levels, the monsters do a variety of really cool things. They lower the levels, and then they have like negates and stuff like that. Cool deck, just I don't think it's all that good. I think it's better than Element Sabers, though that isn't saying much. I think it's better than a lot of these decks, actually. It's probably somewhere around here. Probably pure, yeah, I think it's probably somewhere around here. This is another deck, don't play it. Literally, this card's at 1. Like, final countdown is at 1. So you have to draw a card that's limited to 1 that can't search in any single way. And then you have to activate it, and then you got to wait 20 turns. How the hell are you going to last 20 turns of Master Duel? Like, yeah, this is cool. If you're in silver tier, have a blast. Have an absolute blast. I'm not going to stop you. But if you're, like, above silver tier, like you're in platinum, you're not going to pull this off. It's a disaster. Next, we've got ffloowandereeze. It's missing a support card, but I think it's definitely still, like, around a tier 2 deck. This deck is just one of the most annoying decks to sometimes play. It really is. It's one of the frustrating deck building parts of Master Duel, because you have to say to yourself, do I play Master C? Like, do I play Max C? Because I might run into ffloowandereeze, and Max C does literally nothing against Max C. I mean, Max C does nothing against ffloowandereeze. And then the other issue is sometimes you straight up lose to this deck. Like, if your opponent goes first and they set up a barrier statue and an M-Pen and all this insane stuff, you literally just lose the game. But again, this deck struggles with breaking and going second. It's got a support card that hasn't come out yet. That's going to come out at some point, which will make the deck probably like a tier 1 deck. It is a very strong deck, like a very strong engine, but I don't think it's quite that good in Master Duel. I think it's a lot better than the TCG/OCG. But again, when the new card comes out that can help you dodge imperm, stuff like that, I think it would be a tier 1 deck. I don't know when that's scheduled to come out, but I think it's here. This is Flower Cardigans. This deck will take 2.5 hours to play and then do absolutely nothing. But don't max C them, because you will lose. If you ever play against this deck, don't max C them. They can deck you out. They will just special summon, special summon, special summon. And then when they're finally finished, you just go, oh, that's it? Okay. And that's it. And then you Raigeki their board. Next we've got, this is Fluffles. I think Fluffles is like a top of rogue deck. Not a bad thing. Very strong going second deck. It is like sometimes if your opponent doesn't know if your opponent doesn't know what this deck does, you have already won, because it does so many insane things. Really, really strong going second deck. You would never see it. You see just a bunch of like little stuffed animals hitting the board, and all of a sudden your life points are at 0. Really cool deck. Fortune. This is not Fortune Ladies. This is Fortune Fairies. They're just terrific. Don't play them. Fortune Ladies are a decent deck. They got support somewhat recently. I want to say in the last 2 years, it just wasn't enough support. Again, I don't recommend playing this deck. I think it's a cool deck. A lot of people like it. But I wouldn't say a lot of people like it. You almost never see anybody playing it. But again, I just don't think it's quite strong enough. I'm going to take this as... What is this? Pure Frogs. I don't think it's pure. We'll say it's Paleozoic Frogs. Paleozoic Frogs is like, it's a decent rogue deck. The deck struggles because Toad is at 1, and Toad is definitely not getting put to 2 or 3 because obviously sprites are on their way and they don't want to have to deal with that. So we're going to keep Toad at 1, and because Toad's at 1, it basically forces you every single time after you use Toad's Negate to tribute itself, and then you have to use the Toad in the graveyard to bounce itself. You don't have the option of putting a dupe frog or something else, or a swap frog back into your hand. And because you have 1 Toad, it's one of those situations much like Multi-Faker and much like ABC Buster Dragon used to be in, where if your opponent calls by the grave your Toad, you literally sometimes just lose the duel. That's kind of the problem with the deck. Again, I think you can make it 2 platinum and stuff like that, but it's just kind of an issue. Yeah, it's just kind of an issue when you only have 1 of your boss monsters. This is for hires. I think this is kind of like a rogue deck. I think it's getting a lot of new support in the OCG in a couple of sets. I don't think that this deck is particularly good. It just loses on card advantage because you basically special summon draw, special summon draw. That's supposed to replace its card advantage, but in a lot of times you'll make a link monster and all that card advantage will go right down the drain anyway. So that is. But I think it's better than where I play. It's probably somewhere like up here. Yeah. Next is Gaia. Gaia is actually a cool, again, going second deck. Going second deck's like a drag. It's a real struggle in the game. Going second, I think it's really, really strong. You basically just fuse into the Gaia. You fuse into... This Gaia particularly becomes 5200 attack when you use the Spiral Fusion. It can attack multiple times on monsters. It can gain attack once it does attack. Like it has a lot of positive things. 7800 attack, attacks twice. Like it's 52 and then becomes 78 and you attack twice. It's really strong. Sometimes you could just OTK, catch your opponent off guard. Again, going second is just really tough. And you have to ask yourself, why would you play this when it's like the 5th best going second deck, right? There's just better going second. Like Dinos is a better going second deck than Gaia, for example. So you just play the dinosaurs if you want to win more often. But again, if you just like the aesthetic of the deck, I get it. I personally like this deck quite a bit. So if you like it a lot, then play it by all means. I think it's a decent going second deck. This is Galaxy Tomahawk. Very, very strong card, but this card is, again, it's more of just an XYZ monster that people use. It's an ends to a mean. You basically, I'll just put this up here. I'll put this next to next to this Armed Dragon deck. That's literally what you're doing. You're using the Armed Dragons to summon this, and then this to summon the tokens to summon the Auradon, and then Auradon will get you to all of the proper plays that you need to do. This is Galaxy Eyes. I think it's close to Blue Eyes. It's very similar. Like a lot of these rogue decks that I placed are interchangeable. Like if you feel like, oh, this dude doesn't know what he's talking about, I think Dark Lord should be up here. Like, dude, it's not. It's rogue. They're all interchangeable. If you think that this should be here and this should be here, it's not the end of the world. Just place them wherever you think. Next we've got. I have no idea. I know what this card is, but I don't know what this is referring to in terms of a deck. This has a burn effect, but I don't think you can even like fully resolve that effect anymore. I don't think it's possible. Pure Geargia is not that good. This card's good because it searches a machine monster, but Pure Geargia is just not strong enough. It doesn't do enough whatsoever. I think it needs more support. Gem Knights have a lot of cards hit on the ban list, and I think it definitely needs more support. So you just can't. It's very difficult to actually resolve the FTK. Brilliant Fusion is banned. If Brilliant Fusion was like at 1. Maybe we could talk about this deck being like somewhere up here, something like that. But as of right now, it's just definitely needs more support. All it is just a big, stupid beatdown deck right now. It's just not quite strong enough. Generators is probably up here. It's had a huge loss, which is that it lost Calamities. And Calamities was like one of the really, really strong cards of the deck. You could always spit out a Calamities. And without Calamities, this deck is kind of in a bad spot. We've got Ghost Tricks. It just got new support, but I don't think it's enough support. So needs more support. It is Giant Ballpark. I'll put this next to Gaia. One of my favorite decks of all time. I love it. I've taken it to regionals. I've had great times with it. I've done well at regionals with it, but this deck is just not. It's it's in the, again, like a lot of these decks in the hands of the right pilot are actually quite good, but the problem is it's going to have a lot of struggles, like against Despia, for example, because if you don't OTK your opponent will outgrind you, because all it does is spit out 3 monsters onto the board that are 2,000 attack each, and if you don't finish the duel then and there, you basically will lose the upcoming turn, because this deck has almost no crying game. It is literally a going second deck, and again, you have to ask yourself, there's so many going second decks that are up here. This is like a, like the 6th best going second deck out of all of these decks. So wouldn't you just rather play the better going second deck and not have to struggle as much playing this? But it is a very good budget deck. That's the one awesome thing about it. So if you're looking like for another deck, like let's say you already have Despias and like, let me make another fun deck, this is a good fun deck, and you won't like take a bunch of L's, for example. Gimmick Puppets needs more support. I don't think this deck is strong enough at all. It's like an XYZ. It's an XYZ deck, but you very, very rarely ever see it. Next is, this is Gladiator Beasts, probably like somewhere up here. It's a rogue deck. You can mix it with tri-brigades and make it a somewhat competitive deck. You can end on like an Appaloosa. This guy's a negate right here. You bend on like an Appaloosa, this guy, and like 2 more interruptions with some of the spawn trap cards. Decent deck, but nothing like too scary. This, I'm going to count this wherever I put Grand Maju, because this is literally like a Grand Maju deck. You play this in the Grand Maju deck, you spit out a rank 8 monster, and then you can use that level 8 monsters, which is the Hextrude. Then you can activate Hextrude, pop a card, and then you can basically go into like your rank 8 play, your rank 8 plays, and then in addition to that, this banishes cards from the top of your deck every standby phase, which can help you play in a Grand Maju deck. Goki is like a decent, I'd say like middle of the road rogue deck, nothing too crazy. It's basically a warrior spam deck. It's good in certain like festivals. Like if they had a Link festival, this deck would actually be like somewhat decent. Wouldn't be the most like broken deck ever, but I actually think it's quite a, again, it's quite a decent deck. It used to be really, really meta defining, but a lot of the cards, like the Nightmares, got hit, so the deck just isn't quite as good as it used to be. This is not a good deck. This is the Gradius deck. It had a little bit of time in the sun, a few, like almost a decade and a half ago, but I think it's safe to say its time has passed. Next we've got Necro Valley and the Gravekeepers. Gravekeepers is a very, very strong rogue deck that has a lot of really good matchup against the metagame. Like it has like really a lot of really, really strong matchups. Like if you play this deck against Eldl Lich, you literally just win. Like you literally just win. Because they have nothing that they can do. They would have to draw a hand that has a way. They would have to have Conquistador, which is limited to 1, and Scarlet Sanguine. That would literally their only out to this card. Either that or to have Eldl Lich in hand. That is literally their only out to this card. And again, against, you look at a lot of the top tier meta decks, it's very good against Despia because they can't banish out of the graveyard. Good against Dragonlink, they can't special summon out of the graveyard. Good against this, they can't revive Eldl Lich, they can't banish out of the graveyard. Yeah, it wouldn't be not that great against Altergeist or these two. Good against these decks right here. Good against this. Good against, obviously, heroes. It's like, it's got a 50-50 where you activate it against certain matchups and you just win. It's really, really strong against certain matchups. You can't banish out of the graveyard, and you can't move stuff out of the graveyard. And the entire deck is built around keeping Necro Valley on the board. And if you do, you usually win the game. So that's the positives. The negatives is it going second, it just like going second sometimes it's like, oh, I activate Necro Valley. Oh, cool, I have a full board. I have a full board of negates. That resolves. That's fine. I'm going to go ahead and save those for the rest of the cards in your hand. So that's kind of the problem. Gradles is, you can play Gradle Kaijus, like steal the Kaijus. It's a gimmicky deck. I don't think it's quite that strong. Grand Maju, I'd said I put it next to the Strongberg. Again, this is just another flavor of Grand Maju, and then there's pure Grand Maju. You play Control Grand Maju. It's still a very, very strong deck. You just banish a bunch of stuff. Set this card, hope your opponent's stupid enough to attack into it, and you win the duel. Or you could just attack and win anyway. Next we've got, this is Gusto. I don't think these are strong enough at all. The only thing you really have is, yeah, there's like a weird strategy where you can like attack into your opponent's monster, but your opponent takes all of the damage, so you just keep floating all of these Gusto monsters into other Gusto monsters, and you can OTK your opponent basically, but I don't think it's quite strong enough. This is Harpies. I think Harpies is definitely like a rogue deck. Harpies is a deck that's very strong against a very specific thing, and this is a similar pattern, right? So we've had Harpies. Harpies is very good against back row decks, but Harpies is also very good against. Harpies is also very good for summoning Tomahawk. It's very easy to summon Tomahawk in Harpies, and you can basically end on an endless negate or an infinite negate with Harpies. Just because you can summon Chandler, and then you can activate Chandler, discard a Harpy, summon Harpy's Pet Dragon, overlay, and then you have 2 level 7s, which gets you to the Galaxy Tomahawk, and then Galaxy Tomahawk will basically summon 5 tokens, and you can get to either the Endless Negate, or you can get to, what's the other thing? Either Endless Negate or the old Needle Fiber combo where you end on like a Thunder Dragon Colossus and all that other stuff that people were doing in the previous meta. The problem is you have to play a bunch of bricks inside your Harpy deck, which can be a little bit of an issue. But decent deck overall. I have no idea what this is. I want to say it's Hazy Flames. Hazy Flames needs more support. I don't think Hazy Flames has gotten a new card in like, I don't even know how many years, dude. I literally do not know. I think Hazy Flames is just, it's one of those decks. It's been so many years it needs support. This is heroes. I've already ranked them. I put them right here. I'm going to just assume this is a hero deck. Phoenix Enforcer itself is not a deck. It's a decent engine, but heroes is actually the deck, so I put it there. This is Ice Barriers. You almost never see this card played, or this deck played. I'd probably say with the new supports, probably around Rogue. It also just got Trishula to 2, which again, I don't think is going to have a huge impact on the deck. I think it's definitely still a Rogue deck. Alistair and the Invoked package. I'm going to say this is like Alistair, Dogmatica, Invoked. I think it's definitely like around a tier 2 deck. Good grind game, good engine, stuff like that. It's just, I don't think it's enough for this meta. Next, we've got Cyberstein. I don't even see why this is here. It's not a deck, it's a card. Again, I'm just kind of like, sometimes when these, I don't know why it's here. This is Attic Nisters. It's a good Link slash Synchro slash XYZ based deck. Good deck, strong deck, ends on an endless negate. Like, not an endless negate. It ends on a monster unaffected by everything. That's like 6,000 attack. Really strong monster, tough to get over. A lot of decks, if they're not playing Kaijus, literally can't do anything, and they eventually just lose the duel. That it's it going second, going first and going second. It can just make that monster basically either OTK or sit on that monster, and most decks don't really have an out. This is Infernities. I'd say it's probably somewhere around here. Infernities has actually gotten new support recently, but I always say this with a lot of these decks, like, if Infernity Archfiend just went to 2 or 3, the deck would be so much better than if they continuously release new support for this archetype. Like, they need to put Launcher to 3 or 2, or Archfiend to 3 or 2, and then the deck can actually be somewhat decent again. But releasing new support doesn't actually, like, it doesn't replace the really good cards that the archetype has. Noble Knights or Ignoble Knights, or the new Noble Knight Synchro Monsters, probably somewhere around here. It still has I sold. It still has a lot of cool things. It doesn't have access to Needle Fiber anymore, so I think it's definitely like somewhere around Rogue. Decent deck, but nothing too broken. This is Infernities is probably like one of the best fire decks in the entire game. I'd say it's probably a tier 2 deck. It's another going second deck. You just go second. You play it either with Lair of Darkness, or you play it with like the Monster Gates, the Reasonings. You activate them. I think Reasoning's at 3 in this game, which is kind of like nuts. Yeah, Reasoning's at 3, so you could just Reasoning and just sift through your entire deck. You can play Grasslick Screener. Like, this deck has so many more options in Master Duel than it does in the TCG. And then, of course, you have all of these graveyard effects that activate after you mill all this stuff. You also have Fairy Tale Snow. Yeah, this card is like really strong. Jinzo is like, it needs more support deck. It's one of those things, again, this is, again, a common thing in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right? You have Alley of Justice, which is good against lights. You have the Exo Sisters, which is good against graveyards. And you have Jinzo, which is good against traps. Like, the entire deck is good against traps, and it hopes that your opponent either activates their trap. It literally has a card that says, like, oh, your opponent can set a trap, and then you can, like, summon a Jinzo or something like that. Like, it literally helps your opponent put trap cards on the board. if you're playing against a trap deck, this card can be really, really strong. If you're not, like, it's kind of dead. Pure Kaijus is somewhere in... You wouldn't play Pure Kai. Let's be honest. Kaijus are either a going second engine, or they are a going first, like, Crusadia package engine where you can make a Gamma Seal with, like, multiple negates. But most of the time, no one's playing Pure Kaijus. Don't kid yourself. Katakuri is probably, like, somewhere around here. It's a deck that needs more support. It's not quite strong enough just yet. It could definitely use a few more waves of support. And also, True King of All Calamities got banned, and this was a really decent card to end on in Katakuri's. Cosmos is a good rogue deck, like not a broken rogue deck, but like a good rogue deck. Cool aesthetic. It's all based around like Star Wars, Wizards of Oz. Awesome aesthetic. It has a really, really strong grind game. When you get this thing going, it has a really good like synergy with Lure of Darkness, because the monsters just keep coming back and back. Yeah, the deck is really cool. I'd say the only like big weakness with it is it's just not, it doesn't have quite the grind game of some of the other decks up here, and it doesn't have the most formidable end boards. And I think that's one of the greater issues with it, is it doesn't really like have an end board. You just kind of sit on like a few trap cards and then the big ships, and you know, change into bigger ships, but it's not quite strong enough. Also, like some of the monsters, like they have such outdated techs, like they can't be destroyed by, they can't be targeted. It's like, okay, great, like this that was great in 2017, but no one really cares about targeting now because there's so many like non-targeting removal cards that it just kind of, it seems like a deck that was made far too many years ago and hasn't gotten any support since. But outside of that, if it has the right pilot action, can be quite devastating. This is, it's a decent rogue deck. This is the spiders, crawlers. It's a cool deck. Crawler Deus Ex is like still one of the most insane cards ever printed. Overall, I think it's like a decent deck. It just suffers from its own like text. If they're destroyed by card effects, you get some really good effects, and if they're destroyed by battle, you get nothing. So you gotta hope your opponent destroys them by card effects and doesn't read a single thing you do. The best thing that could happen is if your opponent like Raigeki is a board full of your set monsters, then you each go like plus 15. Really good. Karibos as a pure deck is probably like somewhere here. It literally is just a link spam strategy. You just summon Karibos with like the Flute of Summoning Karibo, multiply, stuff like that, and then you just end on a bunch of really, really big link monsters. Lair of Darkness is still doesn't have all its support. I'd say it's somewhere here in Rogue. It's not a bad deck. The best way to play it is actually just to mix it with the Infernities, but Pure is really not a bad way to play it. I think it's a decent deck. It's got some cool, decent going second options, because you can obviously tribute your opponent's cards, monsters for cost, so it's got some really cool effects, but overall I don't think that it can quite survive some of the better decks in the game. Next we've got Lightsworns. This is a deck that realistically needs more support, but it's better than all of the deck cards, like all of the card decks that need more support. It's actually better than them. I'd say it's probably somewhere around like bottom of Rogue tier. It's not broken, it's not bad, it's not good. It's just kind of sometimes you summon raid and activate raid and your opponent effect Veilers and you're just, alright, well, I pass. And then even the end phase effect won't go off because they affect Veilers. Next is Live Twins. You see this deck a lot. This deck is like so prevalent. It's like you see a lot of Dragon Maids and you see a lot of this deck. And I don't think neither of them are really all that good. I think that Live Twins are definitely better than the Dragon Maids, but I don't think that they're like that much better. They do have cool combo potential, and they are very good on card advantage, where you just every single turn just gain control, gain a little card. You draw a card, pop a card, draw a card, pop a card every single turn until your opponent is left on very, very few resources, and then you can win. The big issue with this deck is, man, this deck is really bad against floodgates. Like, it doesn't matter if your opponent's going first or second. If your opponent has floodgates, it is so strong against this deck, because you have to constantly summon during your and your opponent's turn. So if they have like a there can only be one, or a goes in, or like anything like goes in, or any of those cards, you literally have, it's so much trouble to actually play around floodgates with this deck. And obviously floodgates are very prevalent in Master Duel. Next we've got Lunalight. Not Lunalight. This is Fairy Tales. Fairy Tale is an OTK deck that is actually quite good. it's Fairy Tail Luna OTK. I'd probably say it's somewhere around tier 2. You basically play a bunch of dangers and Fairy Tail Luna, and you just normal summon her, search another copy of her, and now you just replaced your card advantage, and then you go through all of your dangers, and she has an effect where you can bounce a monster your opponent controls. If they don't send another monster from their deck with the same name, it gets bounced. If they do, then it doesn't get bounced. So basically, you just pick like an extra deck monster. Your opponent's forced to bounce it and this card. So now you have 7 cards. So you start with 6 cards. You added another card. You summon this onto the board. So you basically have 8 cards, and you can activate the dangers, and you have all these extra names so that your dangers always resolve. So it's basically like a going second OTK deck. It's actually one of the better going second decks in the game. Luna Lights used to be good. Tiger got hit on the ban list. I believe it's like limited. It's not quite strong enough. You really don't ever see this deck, and you definitely, really the only way to play it is the fusion version with the Luna Light fusion, stuff like that, but I don't think it's quite strong enough. Lyrilusks is a deck that didn't really get hit. It just got power crept because just better decks came out, so I think it's just somewhere around tier 2. It's probably around where Zodiac, Tri-Brigades, all this stuff is. It's probably like a tier 2 deck. It just kind of got power crept. It's not quite as strong as it used to be. It's not like anything got hit. It literally just got power crept. Madolche is probably like a top of rogue deck. Strong deck still, very strong. The issue with Madolche is it just isn't... it has a decent power ceiling. It seems like it just continuously loses cards. Not because of itself, but because of other decks. So Pot of Prosperity is very important in this deck. It gets limited to 1. What's another card that's very important? Crossout Designator, very important to this deck, limited to 1. Like, there's cards that are outside of this deck, goes in match, limited to, like, semi-limited. Like, those cards did not get limited and semi-limited because of this deck. But because they got semi-limited and limited, it actually hurts this deck. Which is the same situation like Blue Eyes is in, where this got... this lost Crystal Hack the Fibrax, and this lost Crossout Designator, stuff like that. So it hurts the deck, but at the same time, it's still it has a very, very high ceiling. Next, we've got Magical Musketeers. I think this is a decent rogue deck. It's a quite strong rogue deck. Basically, going second and can summon max, and then can either add a bunch of spells and traps, or that can be activated from the hand, or it can summon a bunch of monsters. Depending on if your opponent has a lot of monsters or spawn traps, you choose one and you either add a bunch or you summon a bunch. It's very good. The problem is the deck's actually better going first. And its best card, which is the Max, which is this card right here, is really good going second. But the actual structure of the deck, it's better to actually go first and kind of like set up, and your opponent activates stuff in your columns, you activate stuff in your columns, and you basically gain all of this additional card advantage. So the deck kind of falls into a weird thing where it wants to go first, but its best card is going second. So that's why it's kind of like in the rogue tier. You don't see it that often. Magic Key is another deck you just don't see that often. It's a cool deck based around like a normal monster and different attributes in the graveyard of Magic Key cards. You get additional effects, but again, it just doesn't. It has like a cool like summoning. Has a really cool like startup game, but it doesn't have a great like end board or stuff like that. Next is Magista. This is definitely like somewhere around rogue. It's a decent rogue deck. Again, it just basically is a deck that equips monsters from the extra deck, and based on like which cards you equip, you can negate those monsters that your opponent has, like from their extra deck, negate their effects. It's kind of like a skill drain for certain summoning mechanics. So it's got certain cool uses, but again, it's one of those decks like you play against the deck with floodgates and you just sort of lose. But it's a cool strategy. How much do we have here? Not much. Marincess is... when the new support drops, I think it's going to be higher up. It's coming up sometime soon. The new stuff's going to drop. As of right now, I think Marincess is kind of like a rogue deck. It's like a cool link spam deck, Cybers. But again, it's just waiting for more support. When the new support drops, I do believe that the deck will actually be somewhere around here. But until that, I think it's stuck where it is. Mathmex is always a strong deck. This is another deck. I think this is like top of rogue. It's waiting for another support card, which is the Diameter. Not Diameter, Circular. It's missing Circular. When Circular drops, again, this is one of those decks where I think it will be somewhere like up here, maybe even tier 1. But as of right now, I think it's kind of stuck in the same place as Marincess, where it doesn't quite have the power to make itself one of the higher tier decks. Mayakashi is just not that great. It's a zombie deck that's just not that great. The best zombie deck to play is Eldl Lich, followed by Zombie World. Mayakashi is just, it's not quite there. It's not quite strong enough. This is a Mecha Phantom Beast monster, which we've already reviewed down here. Mecha Phantom Beast Pure are just not that strong. This particular one, I think, like, discards a monster from your opponent's hand. They're not that strong. Don't play it. All right, next is Megaliths. Megaliths is another deck that's just like, it's a ritual deck that's just not quite as good as other ritual decks. The best ritual deck in the game is still Drytrons, so just play Drytrons. You can mix Drytrons with the Megaliths. They give you some cool stuff where you can like pop on your opponent's turn, stuff like that. But again, I think just having the Heralds is just better than the Megaliths, so definitely somewhere in Rogue. Next is Mech Knights. Mech Knights is either like top of Rogue or even tier 2. It's just a good going second deck. Most people don't play around the Mech Knight like effects, which is that if you have multiple cards in a column, you can just summon. Most people don't even play around those effects anymore, so you can catch people off guard by playing them, and then they go, oh damn, and then they realize they put 2 cards in one column, and now you get all these bonus effects, and you can basically win. It's also very good with like invoke, stuff like that. I'd probably put that like bottom of tier 2. Good deck, probably somewhere around tier 2. Melfies are definitely just probably somewhere around here. Best way to play this is mixing it with tri-brigades. Tri-brigade Melfi. Sometimes you can go into like the rank 2s. They all have cool effects where during your opponent's turn they can float into more monsters. And then they've got some monsters. They have the XYZ monster that negates. Definitely some cool effects. Just not quite as good as pure. Not quite as good as pure tri-brigades. Melodious Diva. Melodious Divas, I think, is a deck that just needs more support. It does not put enough on the board to actually do anything. It basically it's a deck that would have been formidable maybe a decade ago, but in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, like, you have a board that, it can't be destroyed by card. All right, great. I'm just going to bounce the one that protects the others into the extra deck, and then now I can do whatever I want. So it's not quite strong enough. I'm going to put this, which is Mermills. I'm going to put the Mermills where I put the Abyss stuff, which obviously if you're playing Abyss, any of the Abyssians, you're going to play the Mermills. Atlanteans, I mean to say. Metal Foes is yet another kind of like decent pendulum deck, but again, it's just worse than the other pendulum decks that are available, which is Endymion and the Pendulum Magicians. Next, we've got Monarchs. Monarchs is a tribute-based archetype. I think it's somewhere in kind of like dead center in the middle of Rogue. It is literally a worse True Draco, and in a lot of ways. Not in every way, but in a lot of ways. It is like kind of like a worse True Draco. It's kind of like toe-to-toe with True Draco and Master Duel, but it's definitely a worst version of the unholy ffloowandereeze. Ffloowandereeze is just a better normal summon / tribute deck. See, the drawback with this is you do actually sometimes special summon, right? You summon little guys. With ffloowandereeze, you never special summon. You literally only normal summon. So you can play under a lot of floodgates that prevent you from special summoning. You can play under the floodgates of not only special summoning, but you can play under like Gozen, because most of the ffloowandereeze are wind, with the exception of Robina. And then on top of that, you can play under the floodgates of like Rivalry and stuff like that. You can play under a lot of the floodgates. And also your graveyard doesn't matter to you. So even if your opponent has like Macrocosmos, it doesn't matter. You can play under D-Shifter, and you can play under Maxi. Like, it literally is Monarchs, but you can play under so many more other strenuous floodgates than Monarchs. It is literally a better Monarch deck. And then the end board is much, much, much better. The thing that this deck has going for it is it has like the trap cards that float, it has the spell cards, it has a lot of draw power, it has a lot of search power, stuff like that. But this deck it plays on your turn, your opponent's turn, and once it gets going, there's nothing you can do about it. Both, ironically, have a similar issue, which is they both have problems with breaking, but objectively, this is just the better tribute summon deck. If you're playing Monarchs, it's a worse version of ffloowandereeze. I know a person in real life who used to play Monarchs and he moved to ffloowandereeze, because ffloowandereeze is literally just a better Monarch deck. Next, Aliens. Mutants. Mutants is like a cool rogue deck that you can sometimes play. You've got some reptiles, kind of like a multi-type deck. I think it's a cool deck. The problem is, again, its ceiling isn't quite that good, and it doesn't end on the most formidable board. But I think it's like a cool deck to pick up and play sometimes. It's a reptile deck that is better than some of the other reptile decks, like, where are they? Better than like aliens, for example, but it's not the best reptile deck. Next, we've got another ritual deck. I think this is better than megaliths, but I don't know if this is better than some of the others. So this deck is actually quite good. You can play Necros Unicorn, summon it, and it's basically like a skill drain for monsters from the extra deck. This deck is very good to mix with Dogmatica, but again, Dogmatica is in a weird place where Nadir Servant is limited to 1. It's not coming to anything other than limited to 1, and that's kind of an issue with the deck. It's not, it's limited. Next, we've got the Neos cards, specifically Neos. I think Neos is a deck that needs more support. It's a decent deck. It can make like Rainbow Neos. Unfortunately, Air Neos mysteriously is not in the game. I don't know why, but it's not in the game. And that is actually a big part of one of the ways that you can actually close the gap and win the game sometimes, which is with Air Neos. The other issue with this deck is, there's new support on the horizon. It's probably coming out in the next few sets, but I'm excited for it. But as of right now, it's one of the decks that just needs more support. This is a deck that needs more support. This is the Nephthys cards. Again, it's just a ritual deck. It requires a lot of it's very resource intensive. And this particular card is a level 2 ritual monster, and it actually does a lot. It literally summons a ritual monster from the deck, ignoring summoning conditions. One of the craziest things you could ever do, and it's still not enough. It's crazy. If this was in any other ritual archetype, it would actually be like a huge deal, but in this archetype, it does like nothing, because none of the ritual monsters are really worth summoning. It needs more support. I have no idea what this is. I'm like in shock. Ninjas. Ninjas is a deck that needs more support. Luckily, it is getting more support. It's a warrior deck that is just worse than a ton of other warrior decks, so just play those and don't play ninjas. Not quite good enough. This is the Noble Knights. I've already reviewed this. I put it somewhere up here. I'm going to pretend I remember where I put it, but I think I put it somewhere in Rogue. It's a Rogue deck. The Noble Knights are somewhere in Rogue. You've got one of their main equip cards are now banned. The one that banish 2 warriors, add it back to hand. That thing is banned in Master Duel. It's kind of the problem. Nordics you can actually play. It's a decent Rogue deck. You can mix it with the Adventure package. It's actually kind of a decent deck. The issue with it is, again, the Adventure package has continuously gotten hit in the game, and that's kind of been a drawback. Alright, this scares me, because this is actually Numerons. So this is Numerons, and I just realized what I did. So this is Numerons, and this is actually Cubic. I knew I did something wrong. So Cubics is probably somewhere down here, and everything that I said previously about Numerons is now still what I said about Numerons. And Cubic is actually a decent burn strategy. It's a burn / kind of like OTK strategy that you can play. It's a decent deck. It can catch a lot of opponents off guard, but I don't think it is quite a super winning strategy. Next, we've got Nurse Burn. Nurse Burn has a lot of cool advantages in Master Duel. Again, it's one of those rogue decks that sometimes you play against it and your opponent just has all the cards. They have a gift card. They have a way to get to Nurse Burn. They have, they have the Ixchel in hand to get to Nurse. They get to the Nurse Reficule, they summon it, and then they have the gift card and the card that you gain life points, and they have 3 Upstart Goblins, and everything goes wrong, and sometimes you just lose, and there's nothing you can do about it. And it's kind of the issue with this deck. Sometimes you just straight up lose. Next, Odd Eyes / Pendulum. I'm going to count this as the big pendulum deck full of all of the various pendulum stuff. I'm not going to say this is just Odd Eyes. So assuming you're playing Pendulum Magician with all the, Pendulum Magicians with the Heavy Metal Foes, Electromite, all that stuff, it's probably a tier 1 deck. It's close to Endymion. It's very, very strong. It's very resilient. It doesn't really need the graveyard. So a lot of the things that negate the graveyard, banish, stuff like that, isn't really a big deal. You can play around Call by the Grave because literally your monsters don't hit the graveyard. So it doesn't matter. But for some of those reasons, this is a really, really strong deck. Next, we've got the Ugdoatic. This is a snake. It's like a snake deck. It's like a snake pit deck. It is a full reptile deck that they all benefit from going to the graveyard, and you have a card called Snake Rain in Yu-Gi-Oh! That you discard a card and send 4 reptiles to the graveyard. It's like totally insane. And then you trigger all of these various effects. It is the best reptile deck in the game. With that said, it's played with Lair of Darkness, stuff like that, so I'll put it right next to Lair. With that said, this is only a rogue deck, and it is the best reptile deck of all time. It is getting some additional support in future sets, but again, I think it's a decent deck, but nothing too crazy. Ojamas are a fun deck to play. It's somewhere in like Rogue. This isn't very much a gimmick deck, but you basically like go second, you use Ojama Blue, attack, and then you can just keep spamming Ojama Blue to search stuff, and then you can summon the A to Z Buster Dragon, or the ABC Buster Dragon Catapult, and then you can basically banish your opponent's field and graveyard. Crazy cool, but not cool enough to win. So a few cards. This is cool. We've got Orcust. I think Orcust is like a tier 2 deck. It's got a card that went to, I believe, 2. I think it was the Heart Pourer went to 2. Again, I don't think that the deck is like that much better, but it's definitely better than it was before. I think it's definitely like a tier 2 deck, but it's one of those things where it was good a few years ago, but in the modern game, I just don't think that it's quite as strong as like Despia and swordsoul, stuff like that. So it's probably somewhere around there. Pendulum Magicians, I've already spoken about this. Pendulum Magicians is a very strong deck. I think it's probably around tier 1 deck. I'm going to put it next to Odd Eyes, because you basically play all this stuff in these decks anyway. It's basically like a Pendulum Mash deck. Penguins are a very funny deck. Fun deck. I love it, but it's definitely a needs more support deck. Yeah, going second is a real struggle. Going first is kind of like decent, especially when you can set up this guy. This guy will set the it'll set Penguin onto the board, Penguin Soldier onto the board, and then whenever you send anything to your opponent's hand, it basically gets banished instead. So that's pretty cool. But again, it's not quite strong enough. Phantasm Spirals is a good rogue deck. Like, it's a good rogue deck. You can easily get to platinum. You could easily get to diamond. You have a ton of floodgates, and you have this card. You sit on it, and you basically just win. It's getting more support in the Umi support stuff, which will make this a lot better. But again, just kind of wait for that. We've got Phantom Knights. This is definitely like a tier 1-ish deck. Not as crazy as it used to be, but it's definitely somewhere up here. It helps that none of its cards really got hit on the ban list, but a lot of other decks got hit on the ban list. The only thing that this deck really lost is its ability to go into Rongo Bongo, and Rongo Bongo was like so annoying, because if you played against Phantom Knights and they made Rongo Bongo, it was like guaranteed, like, all right, they won this one. Like, if they successfully got to Rongo Bongo with like 6 materials, 9 times out of 10, unless you were playing like Eldl Lich and you could actually like outgrind, most of the time you literally just lost the duel on the next turn. They just attacked for game. But with that gone, that guaranteed first turn win is over, but you still have the regular Phantom Knight board, which is actually very formidable because it can end on like DPE or Phoenix Enforcer, stuff like that. So it's still very strong in that regard. Next we've got, this is the Pirates. I forget what their name are. How am I forgetting? Oh, Plunder Patrol. Plunder Patrol is like a high top of Rogue, maybe even tier 2 deck. I'd probably put in tier 2. This deck is, if you don't know what you're doing against this deck, you will lose the duel. They basically have, equip themselves with other cards, and based on their equips, they gain additional effects. On top of that, they've got some really strong effects, like the XYZ Monster Banishes, stuff like that. Yeah, it's just a really cool deck. Has a lot of recursion, which if you don't see coming, you will lose. Like, this is one of those decks you have to like stop and read the cards. Otherwise, you will lose the duel if you don't know what you're doing. Prank Kids is definitely, the only thing Prank Kids lost was Meow Meow went to 1. Now, if you remember, the last time that they had Meow Meow and the Adventure Package, they won a YCS. This deck is very strong. It's definitely a best tier deck. It's probably somewhere up here. Again, the Adventure Package just shrank and Meow Meow got hit, but all things considered, you can, as long as you can resolve that Meow Meow one time, it's already really strong. You just don't have the additional Meow Meows, and that's kind of like what hurts it. You don't have the second Meow Meow, a third Meow Meow, but that's fine, because once you resolve it once, you already have 2 pops. You can trigger Battle Butler 2 times. You can activate its effect, pop your opponent's board using Meow Meow, and then you can activate it again and still destroy everything. So you can still trigger Battle Butler 2 times, and normally if you Raigeki your opponent's board 2 times while trying to set it up, you will typically win the duel. And of course, you are protected by the Adventure package. Predaplants, I'm going to assume this is pure Predaplants, probably like somewhere around the Rogue deck. It's not quite that strong. Now, Predaplant is going to be a decent engine with tier elements and stuff like that comes out, but not right now. Psyframes is, again, a decent rogue deck. The problem with this deck is, like a lot of other decks that we talked about, it literally relies on your opponent to do stuff for you to do stuff. So if your opponent does nothing, you just got to sit there. And that's kind of the problem with this deck. Once your opponent realizes, oh, that's what I'm playing, it's okay, I'm just going to sit back a little bit and just relax. Now what you can do is you can play like Sangan, link away the Sangan, and then go into the Lambda and stuff like that, and kind of like prompt your opponent to do something. But most of the time, this deck literally relies on your opponent to actually make a play for you to make a play. This is the Psychic Archetype. Somehow I'm forgetting it off the top of my... I know that with... no punks, that's what they are. So this deck is more literally of an engine than it is an actual deck. It's actually a very strong synchro engine. This is another kind of like what do we talk about down here, the assault mode activate engine. It's an engine that helps you get very easily to chaos, very easily to the Chaos Ruler, and then Chaos Ruler lets you mill 5 cards and add one of the cards you milled, so that is pretty good that it gets you to that. But outside of that, like as a pure deck, it's actually kind of a rough one to play. But in this form, it's actually kind of good. Then we've got the Cleforts. This is another it's a rogue deck. It's another what is it called? It's another one of these pendulum decks, and you have to ask yourself, is this better than the other pendulum decks? Right? Is it better than Dynomist? Is it better than all of these other options that are in rogue? But it's definitely not better than Endymion. It's definitely not better than the Pendulum Magicians. It is another one of those things where you're like, okay, I'm playing this, but it's like the 5th best pendulum option available to me. This one basically is one that definitely got power crept. It used to be very good, 3 skill drain in this deck, and all of your monsters basically get buffed while skill drain's on the field. Skill drain is now at 2 instead of at 3, so you're less likely to see it. In addition, it's just not quite as strong as it used to be. Raid Raptors. Raid Raptors don't even use Ultimate Falcon usually. But Raid Raptors mixed with the Phantom Knights is actually kind of a decent deck. I'd say it's probably top half of Rogue. I've seen it played pretty well mixed with them. Yeah, it's pretty decent. You've got the Y-Strike. Sometimes you can end on a decent amount of interruptions, negates. Cyber Dragon Infinity you can end on with the rank up spell. It's a cool deck, but nothing too crazy. Red Eyes is a deck that is, I'd say, decent. I think it's weaker than Blue Eyes and Dark Magician, but I think it's a decent deck. What it has going for it in Master Duel is it can spam level 7s and it can go into Galaxy Tomahawk, but unfortunately it's just a worst way. While it can spam rank 7s, it's worse at spamming rank 7s than the Armed Dragons. Armed Dragons are much more consistent at it because it has all of the various support. It has the Armed Dragon, the Armed Dragon level 7, it has the other Armed Dragon, the Armed Dragon Pile, and it has the Tempest, which can be activated because they're both winds and because they're dragons. So literally, Armed Dragons are a better version of what Red Eyes can do. Red Eyes does have some decent cards available to it, like Red Eyes, the Black Metal Dragon, which is an insane card because it searches not once per turn every time it leaves the field. Has Fang with Chain, has Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon. Has some good cards, but it's not quite insane enough. Relinquished is kind of a decent rogue deck. Has some good matchups, but for the most part, it's not really worth building. Venomenaga and the Venom cards are probably stopped before it's too late. It just doesn't have enough support to do anything. It's again, just a worse reptile deck than Ogdoadic. Ogdoadic is just so much better wherever I placed it somewhere in Rogue than this deck, and I would recommend playing that instead. The Red Dragons, the / Resonators is a decent deck somewhere around here. If your opponent doesn't know what they're doing, you can set up some insane huge monsters, especially this one. This one is crazy. This one negates something, banishes itself, and then comes back later on, so it dodges so many different things. So this card's really good. It's 4,000. All their monsters are so giant, but sometimes they can be really, really difficult to summon. That's kind of the biggest like issue with the deck and the biggest hurdle is that the monsters are just insanely difficult to summon. And it requires sometimes so many resources just to summon one monster. If your opponent outs that one monster, that's your entire board. That's kind of the issue with the resonators. You only end on like one big monster, maybe two big monsters. You end on like one King Calamity. It's like, yeah, the card is very, very strong, but like, it's like if they out it, then what do? You just kind of lose. This is a deck that is going to get, as of right now, it's not that great of a deck, but it is going to get support, and when it does get support, it's going to be a very good deck. I would even argue it's probably somewhere around here right now, and it will be somewhere around here. It's going to be very, very, very strong. This is, it's a plant. It says tier in its name. It's like plants. It's a plant deck that you like tribute cards and then activate its effects, especially with the main girl. It's a decent deck, but it's not quite strong enough yet. But it will be when the new stuff from the recent sets comes out. Ritual Beasts are like a decent bottom of the barrel rogue deck, not quite anything special. Rose Dragons was, I'm assuming this is Rose Dragon the archetype, not Rose Dragon the synchro engine. Now the synchro engine got shitted on because obviously Crystron Heckle Vibrax is gone, so there's really no point to play this in swordsoul anymore. But as a deck itself, like Rose Dragons, I think is one that just kind of like, I think Rose Dragons needs more support, if I'm being honest. Again, this was mostly used as just like an engine to make Baron de Fleur, and then use the graveyard effect, and you get the Crystron Needle Fiber. Literally, that's all the deck was used for. It was like a 10-yi, and this thing equals Baron de Fleur. Level 3, level 7, bam, you got Baron de Fleur on the field. This is Phantom, what is it called? Not Phantom, Sacred Beast. Sacred Beast is like a decent rogue deck. When this deck gets fired off, like, they won. Like, they really won. This deck is really strong. Once it gets that field spell and you get to draw every single turn, and you can go into a DPE because you have all these extra monsters on board. Like, this deck, once it gets going, it's a very, very strong deck. But sometimes it can get a little bit of, sometimes if they can interrupt one or two plays, like your Dark Beckoning Beast or something like that, Ash your Dark Beckoning Beast, sometimes you just lose. Or what's worse is if they imperm your Dark Beckoning Beast, that's like, oh, here we go. Literally, you can't play. If they imperm Dark Beckoning Beast, you lose the double normal summon, and you lose the search. It's horrible. Next, we've got Salamangrates. I think they got a card I think Gazelle went to 2 or something like that. I don't remember, but either way, this is a decent deck. It's probably like kind of like a middle rogue deck. Very, very decently strong rogue deck, probably like around tier 2. Definitely worth playing. Sangan is a card. Sangan is an engine in a lot of different cards, even in the modern day. But I just, again, I'm not like, it's really weird that this tier list includes like just random one-off monsters. It's like, yeah, Sangan's a good monster. It's used as a card in a lot of decks. Like, I'm not gonna like, it's a decent engine. Next is S-Force. I think S-Force is a deck that just needs more support. It got one wave of support and hasn't gotten any support since. This is basically a column-based archetype that came out just a bit too late. Yeah, that's what it is, and I based on what columns, and it can move columns. It mostly is based on the columns of the cards. Your monsters gain different effects. IP is somehow a part of this archetype, especially in a lot of the artwork, but I don't think that it's actually quite good. You very, very rarely, if you do 1,000 duels on Master Duel, you might see one person playing this. Shadal's is somewhere. Oh yeah, where I put it right here. It's right next to kind of like Alistair. It usually is played with Invoked, and if it's not played with Invoked, then it's played with some other like fusion engine. Winda is a very strong card. If you can make Winda, you can win the duel. If you go first, you make Winda, and they don't have droplets or impermanence or something like that. They literally just win the duel. So really good. And a lot of times, you can actually play around it with the trap card anyway, around like droplets and stuff like that. Next, we've got Sharks. Sharks is a decent rogue deck, probably bottom rogue deck. This is also getting new support. When it gets new support, it probably gets moved up in rogue, but it definitely will not go past like rogue as of right now. It's definitely just kind of a rogue deck. This is, what am I looking at here? I want to say this is Shino Birds. I think this is Shino Birds. Yeah. Or is this Spirits? I'm going to move this down here. I'm not going to make another mistake. That's probably Shino Birds, but if I don't see Shino Birds, I'll come back to it. Shiranui's is a deck that needs more support. yeah, this is probably around the Mayakashis. They just both need more support. The problem with Shiranuis is they're very slow to start. Like, it requires a lot of graveyard setup to actually use their effects, and you have to be like banishing, you have to have cards in the graveyard. This deck is very good like mid-duel, but it's very bad at starting up. So if you can't start up, you can't get to the mid-duel, and you just lose. That's kind of the problem with the deck. It's a decent engine in a zombie deck, or like a zombie world deck, but it's not really all that great on its own. Simorgs, I'm going to assume this is a pure Simorg deck. Pure Simorg is probably like around here. The cool thing about Simorgs is they get used in other archetypes outside of its own. So you have the Dark Simorg, that's a engine piece in ffloowandereeze. That's pretty decent in ffloowandereeze. It's pretty good in just most wing beast decks. It's pretty decent in ffloowandereeze, harpies, and like raid raptors, any wing beast deck. And then you've got the wing beast bird of sovereignty, which is their link 3 monster, and that's good again in harpies. That's good in just any like Lyrilush tri-brigade, stuff like that. It's good in other generic decks, but it's actually not that great in its own archetype. Simorg's in its own archetype is like a cool deck. It basically tries to lock you out of doing certain things. With Dark Simorg, it's pretty cool, but again, you summon a barrier statue, a Dark Simorg, but most of the time it's just not quite enough, unfortunately. Next we've got Samurai, 6 Samurais is probably, again, it's like a decent rogue deck, somewhere like around here. It's just not what it used to be. It doesn't do quite enough. If you can get that endless loop going where you summon the red guy and the blue guy, you can get essentially infinite resources, and then you can do whatever you want in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! The problem is actually getting to that infinite loop. But if you get to that infinite loop, you can literally spit out your entire extra deck and win the game every single time. Skull Servants is like a cool going second OTK strategy mixed with a zombie strategy. It can cheese you out wins sometimes, but it's not a super consistent strategy. It is very cool in Master Duel that you have the Grasslook Screener. You activate Grasslook Screener, you mill like 3 million cards. Usually you mill like 20 cards. And most of the time, if you resolve Grasslook Screener, you literally win the duel. Really good. Sky Striker is like super annoying. I hate playing against Sky Strikers for a million different reasons. But I have to be realistic. It's probably like a tier 1 deck. Sky Striker is either tier 1. I don't think it's like a best deck in the game, but it is a tier 1 deck. It's very, very, very strong. The good thing about Sky Strikers is they just continuously can just search any card they want, right? Because they have Engage, which searches anything. On top of Engage, they have answers to every single thing that you could ever want to deal with. If you want to deal with a monster, great, you get Afterburners. If you want to deal with a monster in a different way, then great, you have Widow Anchor. If you want to deal with a Spawn Trap, you have Jamming Waves. You literally have answers to every single thing. They're all searchable. They're all recurable from the graveyard. They're all like, you have everything you need. And the engine isn't really that big. You get to play so many hand traps, so many good spell cards, triple tactical talents, a lightning storm, the works. You can play whatever you want. They have so much draw power, so much search power, and it seems like they always draw what they need. It's incredible. I don't know how they do it. But that is Sky Strikers. Very good deck. You can't go wrong with Sky Strikers. Definitely like a tier 1 deck. Don't let anybody fault you for playing the deck. Slash Draw FTK. I'm just going to put it here. This just is not very possible. Sofa Chord is another like pendulum deck that is just worse than other pendulum decks. You have to choose like, okay, am I going to play this, or am I going to play the slightly better Dynomist deck? Am I going to play Dynomist, or am I going to play like, Endymion? Like, Endymion's like the cream of the crop for pendulum decks in Master Duel, and Sofa Chord is just somewhere down in the mix of like in the top 7 of pendulum decks, but really not quite that good. Next is Speedroids. Great for Synchro Festivals. Unfortunately, outside of Synchro Festivals, not that good. Somewhere in the bottom of Rogue. Really cool. Can make Baron de Fleur without even blinking an eye. It's awesome. The problem is, again, sometimes it has not an issue starting up, but sometimes it can kind of have an issue like with a grind game because it doesn't like do too much. It's very good at spitting out what it has in its hand, making as much as it can. Crystal Wing, Baron de Fleur, this bicycle thing, I forget what its name is, the Clear Wing something bike, and then the new giant Clear Wing. Like, it makes some cool monsters. It locks you, I believe, into synchros, and then on top of that, it locks you into wins. It's got a decent rubber band shooter, the Link monster. Like, it's got some decent cards, but in a lot of cases, it can actually put you in a weird position. Spellbooks, as a pure deck, I don't think is all that great, even though it did just get the Spellbook of Judgment off the ban list. I actually think the Spellbooks are better in Endymion than they are in their native archetype. I don't think it's actually that strong. Again, going second, like, yeah, cool. Summoning a Jalgan when you're going first is great. Going second, this deck has a little bit of an issue because all it really does is draw and search and draw and search and draw and search. And that does absolutely nothing going second. But going first, it's actually quite good because you draw and you draw and you search, and then you activate and you search a bunch more, and then you summon a Jalgan. Awesome going first. Going second, not the best. Next, we've got Springans. This is the deck that needs more support. Out of all of the Fallen of Valbaz decks, and there are a lot of them, you've got Tri-Brigade, which was tier 1 at one point. You've got Fallen of Valbaz, which has been, relevant in all of the different decks. You have Despia, which has been tier 1. You have also, is one more, Dogmatica, which has been tier 1. Literally all of them have been tier 1 except for Springans, which definitely this deck needs more support. It's just not as good as all of the other Fallen of Valbaz lore cards. Sad, definitely needs more support. Next we've got Spirals, definitely kind of like a higher end rogue deck. Not quite that great. I think it got another card put to 2, I believe it was like Spiral, I want to say Quick Fix or Spiral Drone. One of them got put to 2. Again, the main problem is that Master Plan is not in the game. Or maybe it is in the game. It's one of the things. It's just not a deck you see often. Like, it's got a decent like play line when it gets going, but it's not quite where it needs to be. This is Starry Nights. I think this is a decent deck. It's a level 7 dragon deck based around Sayaru, which is like a really, really old Yu-Gi-Oh card that was a game promo. It's a decent like control deck. You can use like Dragon Spine, stuff like that. Has a little bit of trouble going second. This card actually pops every single turn. Like, it's got some cool effects. Like, the deck overall isn't bad. It's just not quite that strong. This is kind of like I imagine a Fossil Dyna control deck. This suffers from the same thing it always suffered from, which is going second. Going first, if you summon this and you have like Judgment and all these floodgates, yeah, you can win. Moon Mirror Shield, okay, you can win. Going second, you're going to have a rough time. This is Guru Control. Guru Control is a deck you actually do see in Platinum every once in a while. You don't see it often. I'd say it's probably somewhere around like the center of tier 2. It's not like an amazing deck, but it's one of the better control decks available in the game, just because so many control decks have been so heavily hit on the ban list. It's probably somewhere around tier 2. It's basically a flip effect control deck, very reliant on the field spell. If you out the field spell, you win. But outside of that, say like a decent tier 2 deck. Alright, so next we've got Sun Avalon. Sun Avalon is another deck. I think it's somewhere in like the top half of Rogue. It's one of the better plant decks. Now, when the teardrop cards, these cards, there's a new teardrop card that is actually coming out that will make this deck significantly better. Just plants in general significantly better. I think it's a decent rogue deck, but I don't think it's anything like outrageously wild or crazy. It's definitely somewhere up there, but nothing too crazy. Next we've got Super Heavy Samurais. This deck is somewhere around here. A decent deck, but nothing too crazy. Again, it's just kind of, it prevents itself from having spawn trap cards. It's like a self-imposed Sekka's Light. A real big like drawback to the deck, but like nothing too crazy. Again, not like a crazy deck. You can steal cards out of your opponent's graveyard. Nothing too insane about this deck, but I think like a decent rogue deck that you can sometimes play. This is the Power Ranger deck. Probably somewhere around here. Not the best deck. It can end on this guy, this guy's like unaffected by everything, loses to 1 kaiju, but again, sometimes can be tough to out, has a lot of attack, but it takes quite a little bit to get to him. Suships is missing a support card. I'm going to put him somewhere like around here. This is missing a support card that's actually like out there. I think it's probably somewhere like around here. It's missing a support card that will actually help the deck called Shari. And when that card comes out, the deck will be significantly better. But right now, it doesn't have a lot of monster names. So it can sometimes struggle to actually do the things that it wants to do. But it's a decent like budget deck. Swordsoul. I can't believe it took so long to get here. Swordsoul is definitely like one of the best decks in the game. It's like any of these decks are interchangeable. I'm going to keep moving these around. But Swordsoul is definitely one of the best decks in the game. It's just so consistent because every single time you play, you can put a Baron de Fleur and a Xiao Fang and a Blackout face down. And that is 4 interruptions. And it doesn't seem like a lot of interruptions, but that deals with a lot of different issues, right? Because it's a monster negate, it's a spell trap or monster negate, and then on top of that, it's a pop too. So it can deal with a lot of stuff. Because if your opponent like normal summons and they need that normal summon to stay on board, you just blackout and you pop their monster and that's gone. If they use normal summon, activate a monster effect, you just negate it. If they activate Lightning Storm, okay, cool. You have the Baron Deflect. It deals with basically 4 cards that they have in play, and then the other 2 cards better be able to do something, and you've already wasted your normal summon, whatever. It actually does. That board, as consistent as it is, it is actually very, very strong. And that is the bare minimum board that this deck makes, is the Baron de Fleur with the Chow Fang, with the blackout. You can make more than that, but that is just the bare minimum that the deck makes. Going second, again, it's a very consistent deck. It can do quite a bit. And that's why this is definitely one of the best decks in the game. This, like I said, this is all interchangeable. I think either one of these can be up here or up here. Like, it doesn't matter. I think it's over the next couple of months, once Needle Fiber or Crystron Hackle Fiber X is banned and everything's gone, these decks are actually going to be going at it consistently, because they're all going to be fighting essentially for supremacy, because none of them are really like that outrageously broken, but they have really, really good grind games and really, really strong boards that they can make. Also, they all have a lot of room for like hand traps and stuff like that, so the decks can actually do a lot. So that is Sword Soul. This is the Synchron deck, probably somewhere like middle of Rogue. It just, if they Ash or negate successfully the Jump Speeder, you literally lose the duel. That is your main engine. It is like a, look, the card's a +5. It's an amazing card, but if that card doesn't resolve, pass turn. That's kind of the problem with that deck. Thunder Dragons. Thunder Dragons are a decent tier 2 rogue deck, probably somewhere around here. It was the Thunder Dragon Colossus was being used in virtually every single deck that can make a needle fiber. Thank God that's gone. But Thunder Dragons as a deck themselves, probably around tier 2. Thunder Dragon Colossus is at 1. It's a very strong card. Definitely somewhere around there. Next, we've got Satellar Knights. Needs more support. It's kind of in the same area as Bujin. It's just kind of like an XYZ deck from an era of the past. It's still got cards on the ban list that can be unbanned and still wouldn't have a positive impact on this card. Tenyi Sword Soul is a very strong deck. I'm probably going to put Tenyi and Sword Soul right next to each other. If you're playing Sword Soul, you're probably playing the Tenyis in it. So those probably still go together. Yeah, they're probably around the best area. This is TGs. TGs are just a deck that needs more support. It does not put up enough interruptions, negates. It requires a lot to get started. It's this is a link 3, which is a lot to ask for in a deck that your intention is to synchro summon. Like, your intention is to synchro summon, and then you have to pour the resources into a link 3 monster. Like, it sounds so counterproductive. I don't know what they were thinking when they were designing the support for this. But again, pure TG is not quite good enough. TG Hyperbarian, really good in a Synchron deck. This deck's funny, right? So this is Time Lords. Time Lords is probably like a bottom of Rogue deck, but as soon as there is any event whatsoever, if there's an XYZ event, if there is a common event, if there is a rare event, this jumps all the way up to S tier, because this deck is everywhere. As soon as there's an event anywhere, any sort of special event, Konami almost always misses these cards, and they always are like the most annoying cards to deal with, because you don't need an extra deck. They're all cheap, and definitely a decent deck to play. But outside of like those special events, this is a rogue deck. Time Lords is a fun, really fun rogue deck. I think I like this card a lot. Time Thief Redoer. Again, he's very good in certain environments, in very slow game states, but outside of that, he's just kind of like, not really enough. Tunes are definitely a rogue deck. Somewhere around here, if they get rid of that field spell, I'm sorry guys, it's over most of the time. With the field spell on board, the deck is actually quite decent. You have a lot of protection. You can just banish instead of destroying your monsters to banish off the top. It's not once per turn. You essentially protect your monsters indefinitely. So that part is actually kind of cool. This is Libe. This is the XYZ monster. I'm going to put this next to where I put Earth Machines. Where did I put Earth Machines again? I put them in, oh, you're here. So yeah, most of the time you're playing trains with Libe, with all this other stuff. Earth Machines, trains, somewhere around here, interchangeable. If you're playing Pure Trains is more of like an OTK deck that goes somewhere around here in Rogue. But if you're playing this card with the tier 2, with the Machinas and all of the other Earth Machines, I'd probably say it's somewhere around here. Next, we've got Traptricks. This deck, when it goes first, is disgusting. Like, it's so difficult to play against this deck. If your opponent going first with Traptricks, it is so frustrating. This deck going second, nowhere near as good as it's going for. Like, going second, this deck is like over here. And then going first, this deck is like, I swear to you, this deck is like over here going first. But unfortunately, it's a coin flip. It's literally 50%. So I'm going to put it somewhere near the bottom of tier 2. Decent deck. Just going second is like, it's like night and day. Going first and going second is like night and day. When you go first and you set up all of these traps and you have the Sarah on board and you have trap trick, trap hole nightmares, and you have a floodgate trap hole, and you have the trap hole that when your opponent activates a hand effect or graveyard effect, you can activate it and banish that monster and inflict 2,000, like all that stuff. When you have that stuff going first, beautiful. When going second, you're in a wind turbine. This is a deck that needs more support. Most likely, this is Tramids. It's a rock-based archetype that is just not as good as... Unfortunately, it's just not as good as Adamancipators. It is a worse rock deck than Adamancipators. It basically revolves around field spell. Terraforming is at 1. Metaverse is at 1. You basically use these field spells. When they hit the graveyard, you can use the graveyard effects of the field spell, and then the field spells have on-field effects, which are also very good. But again, you really need to, you really have to evaluate. Is it worth playing this over Adamancipators? And 9 times out of 10, it's not. Honestly, if I'm being a little bit mean, it's probably somewhere around Rogue. You can play like a Rockstone strategy with like Fossil Dyna and these guys, Ties of the Brethren, summon them all out. Decent deck, most of the time it's not quite good enough. Tri-brigades. Tri-brigades, I almost lost them, is definitely somewhere up here with the Lyrilusk, Tri-brigade, Zodiacs. These are all kind of like, these were all good in Season 1, but as the new cards have come out, they've just kind of fallen off a lot of the time. So Tri-brigades is definitely around like tier 2. This is the Holly Angel. This is Trickstars. Trickstars is like a decent-ish burn deck. It's still got some cards that are like locked behind the ban list that should really be unlocked. It's a decent burn deck, probably underrating it, probably somewhere around here. It was very good at the beginning of Link format in like 2017. It's definitely fallen off. It's a burn deck that just inflicts little fragments of life points over the course of time, but it's got some serious consistency issues. True Dracos is another funny deck. So True Dracos at any given time is like right here, and then as soon as there's a festival of any kind, it's like all the way up here. Because it doesn't use the extra deck whatsoever. So you just, it is XYZ Festival? Cool, I'm going to play True Dracos and play no extra deck. So your XYZ Festival doesn't even matter. So yeah, it's down here. It's usually around like Monarchs, like in terms of power level. These kind of like are go toe to toe. Obviously, if the GOAT, which is their best Masterpiece, was in the game, I think the deck would be significantly better, but unfortunately Masterpiece is of course banned. This deck, in all honesty, is just a worse ffloowandereeze. Like, that's the only way I can really put it. Yeah, play ffloowandereeze if you want to play a tribute deck. UAs, I think, is a deck that probably needs support. It's kind of with FAs. They just need more support. They're not quite good enough. This is more of a going second deck than the FAs. FAs are more of going first. But now the decks are actually mixed. This is Formula Athletes, and then these are some kind of other UAs, something athletes. This is Unchained. I think Unchained is a kind of like a higher end rogue deck. Again, pretty good rogue deck, tons of grind game. This deck has insane grind game. Like every time your monster gets destroyed, you float into another one, you float into another one, you float into another one. It's very good going second. It's very good. It's okay going first, but it's very good going second. It's very good under skill drain, for example. Going second is just insane. You give your opponent kaiju, attack into it, just attack into it. Going to the big one, discard, pop. You can do so many like insane things. You literally get on advantage off of losing advantage. So that's kind of like the big advantage of the deck. The negatives of the deck is if they like summon like a nightmare unicorn, like spin your monster, and then you have nothing. Like that is the worst part. Usually you'll have like traps or something like chain. But In a lot of the cases, it's actually kind of bad. Uh, Ustra 6, I don't even know how to pronounce this. This deck is a disaster. It literally has a +7 in the deck, and it's still not good enough. You literally can draw 7 cards, and it doesn't do enough to actually do anything. A lot of the effects are like primitive. It's like book a monster, like special a monster. It's like, they have the most like primitive, like weird effects. It's just not strong enough. And this is supposed to be the archetype that's like tied with Drytron. Like it's in the same lore as Drytron and is nowhere near Drytron. Drytron is like so much better. Next we've got, this is Utopia. Utopia is a decent rogue deck. Great in XYZ Festival, stuff like that, just not really all that great in the actual game. It actually, when uninterrupted, can end on a pretty impressive board, but again, you're asking for a lot when a deck is not interrupted. Pretty cool. Going second potential is great. It can always OTK. It has double, stuff like that, but not quite that strong. Valkyries is a super gimmicky deck that like skips your opponent's entire turn, and then you get basically like 2 battle phases against your opponent. Cool deck, but just it's actually not that easy to get that thing off. It definitely needs more support to actually do something like that. Vampires is another zombie deck. I'm going to put it next to the other zombie decks. It's just not quite good enough. It's not Shiranui, Vampire, and Mayakashi. There's just 3 vampire decks. They're the 3 zombie decks that are more so used as engines in zombie world than they are in their own archetypes, and that's kind of the issue with them. They do have some new zombie cards that came out, like the big zombie, which is a decent card, but again, it's just not quite there. Then we've got, this is Revenge Red's Savior. This is another zombie archetype. I'll put it next to the others. The problem with a lot of these zombie decks is they're fantastic once you have a bunch of zombies in the graveyard. The problem is getting the zombies to the graveyard. Now, this deck is additionally a ritual zombie deck. So now you have to put to get these resources in the graveyard, you actually have to go minus on resources to summon ritual monsters that, if we're being honest, don't actually do that much. And then they have graveyard effects on top of that, which again is just not quite strong enough. So that's kind of like the issue with this. This is additionally getting more support, but I don't think it's quite good enough. Volcanics is a okay burn deck that is worse than Chain Burn. So it's decent, but I honestly, if you're going to burn your opponent, play Chain Burn, play Trick Stars. I don't think that Volcanics is the way to go. Konami has like decided to just ignore this deck, and it hasn't had any support whatsoever. And as far as I can see, it's not getting any support anytime soon. This is Virtual World. Virtual World is still a tier 1 deck. It's probably somewhere like around here. It lost Calamities, and it lost a card in the... It lost a part of the engine, where is it called? The Adventure Engine. It lost a part of the Adventure Engine, and it lost the Calamities. But again, the deck is so resilient and so strong that it really doesn't matter. It had... I think it got second place in the Duelist Cup, which is kind of crazy. So definitely a very, very strong deck. Definitely keeping its tier 1 status. And what's awesome about a deck being tier 1 and not in the best tier is these are less likely to get hit than these. As a matter of fact, these decks are more likely to get cards off the ban list, and these cards are more likely to lose cards. So not only does this deck remain good, but it's actually more likely to it's more likely to remain good for a longer period of time. Next, we've got the Vions. This is a deck that needs definitely more support. It's not quite good enough. War Rocks is another one. In the battle phase, like Giga Chad. Outside of the battle phase, this deck's a disaster. If you can get to the battle phase, have a couple monsters on board, this deck is insane. But again, you got to get to the battle phase and hope that your opponent doesn't negate your field spell. Because if they negate your field spell, the Warrock Mountain, go play something else. Weather Painters is missing, I believe, some support cards. It's missing a new Link monster that's supposed to come out, and I think a new trap card that's supposed to come out. But I don't think, even without those cards, I think that the deck is somewhere around Rogue. It's a decent deck, plays very well under Skill Drain, because basically all of your monsters gain the effects of the spawn trap cards that are in the columns that they're in. So literally you can Skill Drain yourself and it doesn't matter. Skill Drain is like, it's a one-way Skill Drain, only affects really your opponent. Wind Witches are more of an engine. I would not recommend playing this deck pure. I like the deck personally. I think it's a great engine in Harpies and a lot of other wind decks, like these guys right here. I'm sorry, it's getting late. I'm forgetting certain things. But it is a very good engine in certain wind decks, but on its own, it's really not like super strong. It's a bottom of Rogue. Witchcrafters is, again, kind of like a bottom of Rogue. You want to activate as many of your Witchcrafter spells or put them in graveyard, and during the end phase, you get them, add them all back to your hand, which is kind of cool. And then you can, you basically just put them all back into your hand. And it has a very good grind game. The problem is the monsters that you get to put on board are just very, very weak. You end on like a Madame Ver, and she basically it negates all your opponent's monsters, but only once. So it's like an imperm for your opponent's entire field. But again, they can just keep playing, and it doesn't even really matter. She gains a defense, which is cool, but outside of that, again, not that strong. They have another Witchcrafter, which pops cards. So you get to pop cards and you get to negate cards. It's not enough to play. When you compare it to like a swordsoul board, which at its base has 4 interruptions, this one has 2 interruptions at its base. This has 4 interruptions. Actually, at its base, it has 1 interruption because it's the Madame Ver. And swordsoul has, at its very worst board, it has 4 interruptions. And that's why these top tier decks are where they are, and that's why this deck is where it is. Even though its grind game is really good, its startup is just like, its end board is just not that great. World Chalice. World Chalice is a cool combo deck, which I think is somewhere around here. It definitely has trouble. Ever since its Link monster got banned, the deck has just kind of like descended. Not its Link monster. Ever since its Synchro monster, the World Chalice Justicar got banned. Like, the deck has just totally descended. That card needs to be eroded, brought back, and so World Chalice can actually do something significant in the metagame again. It's actually kind of embarrassing. Worm is a horrible deck. It is just... It's just not good. Like, I don't know what to say. Worms are just not good. Worms are one of these, like, dual terminal archetypes, kind of like Ally of Justice and Iceberry and Naturia. Like, they came out at a time where they're just not good, so yeah, just leave it there. This is Yang Zings. I'm going to put Yang Zings next to, like, pure Yang Zings is probably like around here. It's like a decent deck, but if you mix Yang Zings with the Sword Soul / Tenyi cards, they're actually kind of good. Pure, probably around Rogue. I wouldn't recommend playing it pure, just mix it with other stuff. Alright, next is Yosenju's. I think Yosenju's is like, kind of like a lower end Rogue deck. I don't think it's anything that crazy. Again, Yosenju's isn't like particularly broken, particularly good. Definitely like a lower end deck. It's kind of in a lot of ways like... it's kind of one of those rogue decks that's a lot like ffloowandereeze, where you don't special summon, you just normal summon, normal summon, normal summon, normal summon, and you get additional, you basically normal summon one, you get this normal summon another one, normal summon another one, you spit everything onto the board. You can use things like Card of Demise, for example, because you don't have cards in your hand, and then they return during the end phase. It's like if ffloowandereeze mixed with spirit monsters. That is essentially this deck. So it's got some positives, got some negatives. It's one of those like normal summon decks. You decide whether you want to play it. Again, I just think ffloowandereeze is just a better version overall of this deck. But if you like this playstyle better, by all means play it. Next we've got Zephyra. Zephyra is, I'm going to put it probably top of Rogue. It's one of the better pendulum decks available to you. Again, I think that Endymion / Magicians is probably the best one. But if you want to play this in addition to it, you know, you can even mix it that way too. Zombie World. Oh my god, this deck is real. This deck probably more than like for a lot of decks, Kriston Hackla was actually just an engine. Like, it was just a degenerate engine that they used to do totally unaffiliated things. So Sword Soul, for example, Sword Soul, Adventurer Sword Soul was in a deck that just used Hackla to end on this giant, terrible board that was very uninteractive and very difficult to out. But you have decks like, for example, with Zombie World, Needle Fiber or Kriston Hackla was actually a very fair card in that deck. And without it, this deck really, really struggles. Because yes, most of the time, or I'd say 50% of the time, you actually you don't even need to go into Needle Fiber. Like, if you have Unizombie in hand, and you can send the Prime Banshee to the graveyard, and then you can discard the Glow Up Bloom, and you can summon out Doom King Balderok. And that is the main point of the deck, is to summon Doom King Balderok. But sometimes you legitimately cannot get to the Glow Up Bloom, and there is not an in-archetype way to get to that Glow Up Bloom, to get simultaneously to a Glow Up Bloom and to a Prime Banshee. And that used to be, you used to be able to do it with Crystron Hacklefibrax. Plus, during your opponent's turn, you can kind of morph it into, you can use the effects of Doom King Balderok, and then you can morph that monster into a copy of Baron de Fleur. So you get an additional interruption out of it. Now that is all totally gone. This is one of the decks that is really most negatively impacted by the Crystron Hacklefibrax ban. It's actually kind of frustrating because, literally, it was not unfair in the deck. As a matter of fact, it wasn't unfair in a lot of these decks. I would argue that Oradon was probably the biggest problem, whereas this card just, Crystron Hacklefibrax basically just guaranteed that you can get to Doom King. It didn't make this deck broken. It didn't make this deck outrageous. And this was the deck that I actually used to get to Diamond the last few seasons, to Diamond 1. And obviously, I'm not going to be able to play it as much anymore just because, unfortunately, the deck just really got hit, unfortunately. Just losing Crystron Hacklefibrax is a big hit. Branded Despia is the deck. We're just going to put this up here. Where did I lose it? Yeah, this is Branded and Despia. You're going to play these two together. You're not going to play Despia by itself. You're not going to play Branded by itself. You're going to play these two together, and it's going to be one of the best decks. Next is... This is a Morphage, which is a giant Floodgate archetype. It's a bunch of pendulum Floodgate monsters that either floodgate you or floodgate your opponent. Most of the time they are an engine in decks. For example, in Dragon Link, you can activate the effect of Heretic Seal of Heavenly Spheres, bounce your opponent's normal summon, and then you can summon an Amorphage Goliath onto your board, and now neither player can summon from the extra deck, but remember, you've already got a board, so it doesn't matter. Like I said, this is mostly an engine and not a deck on its own. I think it's one that definitely needs more support. It's probably somewhere it needs more support to be an actual individual deck. Mostly just an engine. This is Crystron. They just lost Crystron Hacklefibrax. Honestly, they didn't even use them that much. Quite ironically, it was used in other decks more than it was in its own deck. I think the deck is just okay. It's a decent synchro deck. There are literally better synchro decks. If you want to play a good synchro deck, you just play swordsoul. And if you don't want to play swordsoul, then you just play Virtual World. If you don't want to play Virtual World, then you play Adamancipator, or you play DDDs, or you play any of these other decks, synchro decks that have been anywhere above any of where I placed the Crystrons. Unfortunately, just not as good as some of the other synchro decks. And now lastly, I can't really figure out what the heck this is. I want to say this is a spirit monster, and I want to say this is Shinobirds, because Shinobirds is the best spirit deck, and it's a going second ritual deck, which I've already talked about the issues of a going second ritual deck. So I'm going to put this somewhere around Chaos Max. This is where it is. It's somewhere around Chaos Max. It's a going second ritual deck. It has all of the problems of having to pour a bunch of resources into a monster. And if your opponent negates your spell or the effect of the monster, it's a problem. But the effects of the Shinobirds are actually really strong. The Shinobirds actually shuffle away either 3 spawn trap cards and then summon Spirit Monster from the deck, or they shuffle back 3 monsters on board and then summon one from your hand, like any spirit monster, ignoring summoning conditions. You can summon Imato Iwado, and because it ignored summoning conditions and it was special summoned, it doesn't go back to the hand. So you basically prevent your opponent from activating any monster effect for the rest of the duel until they can out that Imato Iwado. So yeah, there's a lot of positive parts about this deck that is not available in the other going second ritual decks. So for that reason, this deck is actually quite strong. I'm going to assume this is indeed the Shinobirds, unless my eye is tricking me or something like that. But that is every single deck on this tier list. This has been an insane tier list. By the way, follow this guy. This is the person who made the tier list. This isn't one of the rare cases where I did not make the tier list. So if you want to support the person who made this, definitely go follow them. But yeah, this has been the tier list. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you thought I've got anything wrong or something I've missed, let me know. And again, thank you for watching and have a fantastic day.
La 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 la